played tackle in high school and guard. All of our dreams at one time was to make it to the NFL. But life don't always happen that way, you know. My brother meant the world to me. Anybody I love meant the world to me, and he was the same way Jabbar was.
Broad daylight on a summer afternoon, somebody's gunned down.
There's a young black man laying in a pool of his own blood, fighting for his life.
He certainly couldn't talk, but he's trying to write something on his arm in his own blood.
There was a lot of information coming in. The name kept coming up.
It's what police sometimes call a street name.
Every time they see each other, they're at each other's necks, like two boxers in a ring.
Somebody was going to be hurt or killed.
As a young man, there's this need to defend and protect your territory.
He wasn't going to allow him to breathe another day.
It's June 5th, 1995. A quiet summer afternoon in Colorado Springs, Colorado.
Colorado Springs back in the 1990s was a nice little town, not a whole lot of crime.
It's just a normal day where, everybody's kind of tending their business, commuting, routine type day.
Just after 3:30 p.m., the routine is interrupted.
There was a flood of 911 calls coming in, reporting a shooting.
There was a black man who got shot right in front of the Champion Auto Parts store right there by the front door.
The area where this happened was a nice part of town.
Usually where people feel really safe, the last thing they're thinking is that they're going to be a witness to serious gun violence.
Patrol officers with Colorado Springs Police Department arrive at the location.
There's a young black man laying in a pool of his own blood, and he is fighting for his life.
There were several witnesses that heard the gunshots or even saw what happened, rushed over to render aid.
Our victim was laying on the ground, was still alive at the time, trying to breathe. He's gasping for air.
And then the EMTs arrived, and of course they put him on a gurney and they took him, I think, to Memorial Hospital.
When I got there, I could see that the area was cordoned off with police evidence tape. I interviewed a few people. They heard the shots, which happened right outside the front door to the west of the Champion Auto Parts store. They observed two black males. One had a gun and basically shot the other one a number of times. And then this individual ran to the north and disappeared. And no one could give me a good description other than a young, possibly around 20-year-old black male with a white shirt on.
With the shooter at large, police immediately launch a search.
There were only like 3 little businesses in this short strip mall. Moving past those businesses, the next location would be an apartment complex, fairly large complex to the north, and that's apparently where the suspect kind of disappeared. So of course we searched that area. We actually used a dog. We had a canine officer come.
At the scene, a man pulls into the parking lot and asks to speak with the detectives.
He was driving by the auto parts store, saw all the police activity there, and noticed that his brother's car was parked in the parking lot with police tape around it.
He begins to talk to police, and he's saying, "Hey, that's my brother's car."
I got a phone call from one of my cousins, and he said there's a lot of police at the auto parts store, and he thinks something happened to Jabbar. And so I rushed over there. They wouldn't tell me nothing. No, but I knew in my heart that it was Jabbar.
Antoine Jabbar McKenzie was born on January 15, 1975, in Colorado Springs.
Jabbar was one of 3. He was the baby of the family, and he grew up with this close-knit family with his siblings.
We got a pretty big family. We all grew up together, the whole block. We had my aunt and uncle on the corner. My Uncle Larry stayed next door to them. My cousin Kelly and Junior stayed a house down from them. And then on the other street, we had cousins.
Jabbar and his brothers were inseparable.
We was always together. If you seen one, you seen us all. I remember one time we all snuck off from B Street and walked all the way to the mountains over there, followed the creek all the way up to the mountains. And we made it home. It was a little dark. And my mom, they was like, "Where was y'all at?" We went to the mountains. And Jabbar was like, "Yeah, Mom, I'm tired." My dad and Mom took us fishing. We did a lot of fishing, camping. They always made sure my mom would always take us fishing, you know. And I remember there's a time too, Jabbar, we was fishing and he sat on the hook. And my mom had to take him to the hospital because he couldn't get it out.
When Jabbar was 17, his parents separated.
I was 20 at the time. They said they stayed together to raise us so we'd be together.
They did this until the point where they figured that the kids could be on their own, make their own decisions, and they would be good. And it was at that point where Mom and Dad separated. Mom went to live in Texas. Dad stayed here in Colorado.
Jabbar stayed in Colorado Springs, where he attended Palmer High School.
Jabbar had a love for football. You know, he was real passionate about it. You start getting that recognition that people start noticing you and you start feeling good about yourself. Your self-esteem gets good. So I think he was enjoying that.
He played tackle in high school and guard, and he was pretty good. All of our dreams at one time was to make it to the NFL, but life don't always happen that way.
Unfortunately, he dropped out of school in his senior year. Some people, that came as a surprise to him because he was such a good football player and enjoyed it. But all of a sudden, he decides to drop out of school.
Jabbar took a job working with his father, who owned a construction company.
They pour concrete, and my dad taught him how to operate equipment. Basically, hard labor, that's what we do.
Jabbar eventually moved in with his grandma, and it was at that point where he walked in his independence. He was paying bills. He was the man of the house.
With hard-earned cash in his pocket, Jabbar splurged and bought himself a vintage muscle car.
He worked tirelessly in order to pay that thing off. He would continue to fix it up to get it just right.
I remember one day, I said, "I'm gonna get my car painted." I said, we gonna sand it, you know, this, and so we didn't know what we was doing. So by the end of it, we had all kinds of grind marks all over the car and everything. And he was like, "Man, we messed this car up."
Jabbar had plans to take the car on a road trip.
The whole plan for us leaving, my cousin got him a job at the prison to be a prison guard. So he was gonna go to Texas to be a prison guard.
But on the day he planned to leave, his brother, Eric, is in the parking lot of an auto parts store trying to find out if the man who was just shot is Jabbar.
The victim's brother talks to police and says, this could be my brother. I see his car.
He was told then that the person that was associated with that car had been shot and transported to the hospital.
The brother, understandably, is very, freaked out and rushes right to the hospital.
Investigators continue to speak to witnesses. They learn that the shooter might not be on foot after all.
There's a witness on the scene who was across the street filling up his truck at a gas station, heard what he thought was a backfire, looks over and he sees this guy pointing at our victim, and he hears a succession of 6 gunshots, and then sees our victim fall to the ground. He looks down the street and sees the person he saw confronting our victim running down the street and get into the passenger side of a white car.
It had no hubcaps and was being driven by a black male, and it was spinning out.
The suspect got into the passenger side of that car and they left the area.
Investigators stay on the lookout for the white sedan. Then, detectives learn from witnesses who tried to render him aid that the victim might have tried to leave a clue.
He certainly couldn't talk, but he's bleeding pretty badly, and he's trying to write something on his arm in his own blood.
With the last strength that he has, he is trying to tell people what happened to him.
It clearly indicated that he knew and he was trying to put that information out.
A midday shooting in Colorado Springs has left a young man suspected to be 20-year-old Jabbar McKenzie at a nearby hospital fighting for his life. Speaking with witnesses, investigators learned the victim may have attempted to communicate a clue about the shooter before losing consciousness.
He is hit and he falls to the ground. There's a lot of blood. And bystanders run to him to help him. And he tries to write something on his arm. He writes with his own blood.
When we find out that that's happened, we call the hospital. We want to see what it is.
They learn they will have to wait until after he undergoes emergency surgery.
So from there, my next assignment would be to do the scene itself. So I started having the scene photographed. That's kind of the first thing you do.
There was a car parked in the parking lot that ended up belonging to our victim, and that's why he had gone to the auto parts store to get the thermostat.
We started noticing what appeared to be .22 caliber spent casings. We collected 10 of those casings. Some of them were toward the driver's side of the vehicle, some were at the rear of the vehicle, and some were actually on the passenger side of the vehicle. So it appeared as though whoever was firing, they must have fired fairly close to the individual, and then as they backed up away, they continued firing. Therefore, the casings were, strewn around the car, and then apparently ran to the north.
Investigators also locate some cash in the thermostat on the ground.
So it certainly appeared that the individual, the victim in this case, had been in the store, probably purchased the thermostat, and on the way to his car was confronted by this black individual with the white shirt.
Well, it was apparent it wasn't a robbery because he still had money in his hand, and he had an auto part, a thermostat that he had purchased. So you're looking at this, and your thoughts are, well, what happened here? This wasn't a robbery. This was a targeted attack. Broad daylight on a summer afternoon in the middle of a parking lot, somebody's gunned down. This was some kind of a hit.
If the young man did see who attacked him, investigators learn he won't be able to share that with police.
Jabbar McKenzie is pronounced dead at 3:50 p.m. He sustained 6 gunshot wounds to the chest. One of those gunshots went through his heart and another through his lungs.
Investigators head to the hospital, hopeful to take a look at the victim's arm.
By the time we get there smeared, we can't make anything out. But the one witness that saw the shooting says he saw it looked like it was either a J or a K or O.
Having gotten word of the shooting from Eric, Jabbar McKenzie's family gathers at the hospital.
A man and an elderly lady show up to the hospital, and they're saying, we want to see our son. And it's at that time that they're notified that, well, the person that was brought in is deceased, is no longer alive.
A family member had made an identification of the body, and it was Jabbar McKenzie.
The day that he passed away, we were supposed to leave that day. My brother meant the world to me. Anybody I love meant the world to me, and I go out to wait for him if I have to. And he was the same way. Jabbar was.
Mr. McKenzie loses it. His son is now gone. His son is dead. Anybody would have that reaction.
He said that, he wants to know what's going on, and he knows who did this, and he's going to get him, and the detective's trying to calm him down and say, that's not the way to handle this. You don't let us handle this. and Everett walks out of the room. Well, Viola, the Joe Barr's grandmother's still there, so detectives start talking to her and trying to find out some background on Joe Barr.
Grandma told police that Jabbar, he didn't get into a lot of trouble. He didn't hang out with any gangs. According to Grandma, he was just a sweet young man.
Everett McKenzie comes back into the room. He's calmed down now and would like to help out however he can to find out who did this to his son. He said that that Joe Barr had been having troubles for years, ever since high school, with a kid named Kelvin Washington. And he felt that maybe Kelvin was involved in the shooting.
Detectives learned that 19-year-old Kelvin Andre Washington lives a few blocks from the crime scene on Tahoe Boulevard.
Now we need to go talk to Kelvin Washington to find out what can he tell us about this homicide. Was he involved in this?
After 20-year-old Jabbar McKenzie is brazenly shot down in broad daylight, investigators look into an alleged enemy from his days at Palmer High.
I ended up at around 9 o'clock, like 6 hours after the shooting, going to the Tahoe address where we thought we could find Kelvin Washington. And there were a number of other people in the living room area, and one of them was Kelvin Washington. So it wasn't comfortable to be talking to him with all these people. So we traveled to the basement with him and started learning a few things.
His reaction kind of surprised the detectives because he says, I thought you'd be coming by here to talk to me. Oh, really? You're going to tell us you were involved in this? What's going on? And he says, no, I'll tell you, it's common knowledge on the street that myself and Joe Barr do not get along. But I did not kill Joe Barr. He's a typical 20-year-old, wears glasses, and seems to be an all-around kind of guy, I'm here to help you out. I wasn't involved in this. The detectives asked him, well, would you come down to town and talk to us about this? It's better than, us having to talk to you here at your house. Sure. He was very cooperative. He says, I'll meet you guys down there.
At the station, police asked Kelvin to submit to a GSR test.
The gunshot residue test is where police can swab someone's hands and determine they could be the shooter. Kelvin agrees to do that.
While police process the results, Kelvin gives a statement about his history with Jabbar.
He's being very polite, very cooperative, answering all of their questions.
Kelvin says the conflict started when they were both still in high school.
It sounds like Kelvin's girlfriend may have hit on Jabbar. And through that, Jabbar went and talked to Kelvin about it.
Jabbar went to Kelvin to tell him, hey, man, your girlfriend is hitting on me. You might want to watch her. When Kelvin confronts his girlfriend about what Jabbar was saying, she denies it. And this makes Kelvin upset. He goes back to Jabbar and says, hey, man, stay out of my relationship. I don't want to have anything else to do with you. You stay away from me, you stay away from her. Jabbar was not one to back down from a threat, and he saw this as a threat. And so now Kelvin becomes an enemy.
So what started as high school rivalry quickly escalated to an incident where Jabbar showed up at Kelvin's house to fight him.
Kelvin Washington's mom came out on the front porch and had to tell Joe Barr, leave. I don't want you around here messing with my son. He doesn't want to fight you. Get out of here. And Joe Barr leaves.
It escalated to the point where Kelvin says that Jabbar started bullying him. He started throwing bricks at his car. We have two teenage boys here, and they are feuding. Every time they see each other in school, they're at each other's necks, like two boxers in a ring.
It's clear the two young men didn't like each other. But is a high school beef motive for murder?
In order to arrest someone, there's three basic elements that you have to establish: a motive, an opportunity, and the means to commit the crime.
With motive in question, investigators focus on opportunity.
First thing I wanted to do was kind of track his day. What did you do today?
Kelvin says that he was living with his girlfriend and their baby at the time. He woke up, he played some video games that morning, and around 12:30, he left the house to go pick up his green Cadillac. Police think this is a really important detail because the car observed at the shooting was a white sedan, not a green Cadillac.
Kelvin says he spent the afternoon at his stepfather's house on Tahoe Boulevard, where he still was when the shooting took place.
Kelvin also tells police that his family was in and out of the house all day, and this would help confirm Kelvin's alibi because they would have seen Kelvin in the house.
Detectives consider whether Kelvin had the means to commit the crime.
One of the questions they ask is, do you own a gun? Kelvin says, yes, I do.
This is Colorado. This is the Wild West, so to speak. Lots of people own guns in Colorado Springs, so it's not unusual for a 20-year-old to own a gun.
But it's a .380, which again is not the murder weapon. He agrees to actually give the police his own gun if they want to test it and compare it to that .22 caliber shell casing they found. Kelvin is calm, he is agreeing to cooperate, and police often view that kind of demeanor as someone who's not guilty, who is just trying to show that they're innocent.
But just before Kelvin Washington leaves, the results of his GSR test come back.
Detective Hilty came into the room and informed me and in front of Mr. Washington that he came back positive for gunshot residue. I asked him how he was going to explain that. How do you explain you have gunshot residue on you?
He said, I was at the range the other day with my buddy, and I was shooting my .380, so I'd probably have gunshot residue on my hand.
Kelvin promises to return at 3 p.m. the following day with his .380.
He agreed to bring that gun in the next day and turn it over to me so we could examine it. That was pretty much the first interview that night with Mr. Washington. I actually drove him home.
There's no reason to hold him. They got no information that he's the actual shooter in this case. And he's being cooperative, so they're going to let him go.
With Kelvin seemingly in the clear, investigators have no leads until a tip comes in.
There was a lot of information coming in, some to uniformed officers, some to detectives, but the name Nebo kept coming up.
Police quickly understand that Nebo is not a proper name, it's what police sometimes call a street name. The person who committed this murder, the person who shot Jabbar, is named Nebo.
Detectives looking into the death of Jabbar McKenzie have just received a tip that a man who goes by the nickname Nebo is responsible for his death.
A lot of times the only way they're going to find out is if they, hit the pavement, start their networking, and try to figure out who Nebo is.
Detectives were contacted by a local FBI agent who said that he had some information that may be related to this homicide and that he had an informant that had this information and would be willing to share this information. So the detectives met with the informant, and that's when they first learned that Kelvin Washington was also known as Nebo on the streets.
Detectives look into the alibi Kelvin gave in his initial interview.
He's being very cooperative. He says he's got an alibi. He was home all day. You never take a suspect's word for the fact that he didn't do this. He gives you an alibi, you investigate that alibi now and determine if he's telling the truth.
When they take a close look at Kelvin's statement, they note a discrepancy.
But I noticed when he talks about the time period of around 3 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday, the 5th, there's nobody else at the house apparently.
Jabbar was shot just before 3:30 p.m.
And he claims he was there and never left. So that, kind of piques your interest.
The next day at 3 p.m., Kelvin Washington returns to the police station as promised.
He conveniently forgot to bring the .380 and again claimed he didn't know exactly where it was anyway, but went into a little more detail about the issues he'd had over the years with Jabbar.
Kelvin Washington mentioned at one point he and a friend of his went to Bumper's Lounge one night, and lo and behold, Jabbar was there in the parking lot. And Kelvin said, you know, we need to get out of here. I don't want any confrontation to go in here because I know something's going to happen if he sees me out here. So they left the parking lot. But Jabbar follows them out of the parking lot. And it's almost like a chase is going on where he's trying to get away from Jabbar, but Jabbar is following him. And he said it got to the point where Jabbar actually pulled a gun out and started shooting. He said nobody in the car was hit, but his car was hit 2 times.
Kelvin tells police the incident rattled him. He went to stay with his mother in Tennessee for a couple of months, hoping that Jabbar's temper would cool in the meantime.
He drove that car to Memphis to visit his mother, and she actually had the car painted and repaired to cover up those 2 bullet holes while he was down there. So it's, you know, it was documented that there was 2 bullet holes in that car.
But when he returned to Colorado Springs, Jabbar was anything but cool.
Kelvin tells police that Jabbar followed Kelvin's girlfriend back to her apartment, probably looking for him. And Kelvin says at this point, that's the last straw.
He explained that things had escalated recently to the point that either Thursday or Friday, Jabbar had driven by the Tahoe address, fired some shots at the house. He claims that this was witnessed by his stepfather, and then, of course, he goes to the range and does some practice.
When things like this ends up with weapons and guns being involved, people feel that they need to defend and protect themselves. As a young man, there's this need to defend and protect your territory.
Kelvin claims he was ready to defend himself if he had to, but maintains he did not kill Jabbar. Investigators aren't convinced.
And does he have the means? Well, he has a weapon. He practiced on Friday, so that's kind of circumstantial evidence, but we need more than that to make an arrest.
He was asked if he'd be willing to take a polygraph on the statements he was given.
During that second interview, we'd arranged for Nebo, Mr. Washington, to come in on the 7th, and he agreed to do a polygraph.
But before he comes back, detectives get a phone call that changes everything.
They find out who may have owned this white car that they saw leaving the crime scene. They contact a juvenile who was known to be associated with that car.
This informant happens to be a juvenile, a person under the age of 18.
So they went to his house and contacted his mother and said, you know, we'd like to talk to your son. We're investigating this homicide case. He may be involved, he might not, but we'd like to talk to him. She said, sure, come on in, you can talk to him.
At this point, Mom calls him out and tells him that he needs to give police whatever information that they need. He's kind of hesitant because he knows that according to street law, you're not supposed to talk to police, but Mom pushes him to do the right thing.
Well, the kid's mother says, you be honest with these police officers, tell them what happened. And during that interview, he says, yes, he was with Kelvin Washington that particular day.
On June 7, 1995, Colorado Springs police interview a witness who says he was with Kelvin Washington on the afternoon Jabbar McKenzie was killed.
And he was with a guy named Big Will. Big Will was a friend of Kelvin Washington.
He claimed that the 3 of them, Big Will, Nebo, and himself, were driving around in the white car, and they were looking for marijuana.
Nebo was wearing a white t-shirt and jeans, which is important information for the police. Other witnesses say that the shooter was also wearing white t-shirt and jeans.
He said as they're driving down the street, Kelvin Washington is telling them which way to go, and all of a sudden Kelvin says, stop the car and let me out.
They ended up dropping Nebo off somewhere west of the Champion Auto Parts store. Claims the other two drove around a bit.
He says about 10 or 15 minutes later, they come back and pick Kelvin Washington up.
Nebo got back in the vehicle and they left.
He says Kelvin has scored some marijuana, so then they go back to Kelvin's house and they're there the rest of the day. Nothing about any shooting, and he doesn't know about any shooting, didn't hear any gunshots, so doesn't know anything about that.
Detectives suspect that during the 15 minutes, Kelvin shot and killed Jabbar.
They were all together, and they dropped Kelvin Washington off right at the scene of the murder, and then the murder happens.
But the juvenile claims to know nothing about the actual killing.
I don't think that it was as innocent as what it was portrayed, but it was the best evidence that was going to be available to us at the time.
As they wrap up with the witness, investigators receive news that Kelvin Washington is at the police station taking a polygraph test.
I went back to police headquarters, met up with the other detectives, and immediately learned that Mr. Washington, Nebo, had failed his polygraph. So now we've got the polygraph failure, we've got the gunshot residue on his hands on Monday, we've got his presence at the scene on Monday when the crime occurred, we got a witness that puts him there, and we certainly have the motive.
It was determined then to present this case to our assistant district attorney at the time, who reviewed it and said, yeah, we're going to get a warrant and have him arrested.
On the evening of June 7th, just over 48 hours after the murder of Jabbar McKenzie, detectives confront Kelvin Washington with the new evidence against him.
Detectives are telling him, you know, we can put you in this area. No, I wasn't there. I was with Big Will and this juvenile, and we were driving around, but we never went by that auto parts store. They never let me out. None of that stuff happened. The detective was saying, well, you know, we have evidence to the contrary, and we don't believe you. And that's when he said, you know what, I'm done with this interview and I'm leaving. No, you're not. We have a warrant for your arrest, charging with murder. You're under arrest, and we're taking you into custody.
With Kelvin in custody, investigators trained their sights on locating the third person in the suspect vehicle, a man known as Big Will.
We were looking for Big Will as technically a witness, but somebody we thought could potentially be a co-defendant in this case.
Is he helping Kelvin Washington set up this homicide? Is he now driving a getaway car for Kelvin Washington to get away? Another confidential informant was contacted who said that he had seen Kelvin Washington and Big Will on that particular day, and that he had told Big Will that he would take him to the bus depot because Big Will was leaving Colorado Springs that afternoon to go back to Memphis. He picked Big Will up at Kelvin Washington's house, loaded up 6 boxes that he had with him that he was going to put on the bus. He noticed that the case for that .22 caliber pistol was in one of the boxes. He didn't actually see the pistol, but he did see the case for the pistol. So he assumed that the pistol was there and that Big Will was taking it back to Memphis with him.
Based on shell casings found at the crime scene, detectives know Jabbar McKenzie was killed with a .22.
Nebo claimed that he had a .380, not a .22 caliber.
Now we know that Big Will had a .22. Did Big Will give that .22 to Kelvin Washington to shoot Jabbar with?
The witness gives investigators Big Will's cell phone number.
Investigators were actually able to contact Big Will in Memphis. The investigator said, well, would you be willing to come back to Colorado Springs and talk to us? Oh, yeah, I'll be willing to. He kind of backtracked on that, and we couldn't get a hold of him anymore.
Myself and another detective from CSPD, we went down to Memphis.
We were unable to locate him, so we told the local authorities, you know, we need this guy back here on this murder case. If we can find him, pick him up, and that's what happened.
On June 13, 1995, 8 days after the death of Jabbar McKenzie, suspected accomplice Big Will is taken into custody in Memphis.
We first talked to him on the telephone, and he was kind of hesitant about talking to my investigator, but did admit that, yes, he was with Kelvin Washington that day, and that he was driving, and the juvenile was in the back seat. But he says, we didn't shoot anybody. We were just out looking for some marijuana. Okay, well, we're going to bring you back and have you tell this story in court.
As with the juvenile, investigators have no proof that Big Will was an accomplice or even knew the shooting took place.
If we would have been able to charge him from an evidentiary standpoint by then, we would have, and he knew that.
Big Will makes his way back to Colorado, and so does the alleged murder weapon.
We were able to acquire the gun that Big Will had in his possession, and that was the .22 caliber handgun that we're certain was involved in the commission of the crime.
We were able to get that .22 caliber back, make the matches that were necessary. So there was our .22 caliber, which was really the only missing piece of evidence was the actual gun itself.
In January 1996, Kelvin Washington goes on trial for the first-degree murder of Jabbar McKenzie. Prosecutors put eyewitnesses from the crime scene on the stand.
They were able to identify what the assailant was wearing. They were able to identify what kind of car they were driving. They were able to identify which direction he ran in.
But the defense claims that even though Kelvin matches the description given by witnesses, police arrested the wrong man.
At trial, it was the defense's theory of the case that this was not Kelvin Washington, that this was a case of mistaken identity.
Prosecutors allege that what started as a beef between two high school kids escalated until Kelvin sought the ultimate revenge.
He was tired of it. He was tired of being shot at. His car was being shot at. His mother's house was being shot at. He was just tired of all that.
When Kelvin saw Jabbar at the store, he saw his chance to put a permanent end to the feud.
Kelvin saw this as his opportunity to take Jabbar's life. He wasn't going to allow him to get back in the car and walk away and breathe another day.
You can't pull out a gun and go stalk somebody and shoot them 6 times because you're being bullied.
It seemed that the prosecution had the stronger of the two cases. But at the very end, you just never know exactly what the jury's going to come back with.
Ultimately, Kelvin Washington was found guilty of first-degree murder, and in Colorado, that carries a mandatory penalty of life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is where he was sentenced to.
Most homicides, the victim knows their perpetrator. And in this case, it wasn't a family member, it was a known enemy. This is going to be a situation of two people where one's going to be a victim and one's going to be a perpetrator. There's going to be a life spent and there's going to be a life ruined. And in this case, Jabbar's life was spent and Nebo's life was ruined.
It was just inevitable that somebody was going to be hurt or killed, and now we know how it ended.
I took it hard, took it real hard, and you could say I lost my mind a little bit for not being my brother's keeper, you know, because we was close, all of us was close, you know, and I didn't know how to deal with it.
It could have all been prevented if somebody was able to sit down with them and do some conflict resolution. Let's talk about our differences. Let's get all of this misunderstanding out to the surface so we can actually know.
The crisp, biting air of mid-March in southern Ontario has a way of clinging to the skin, a stubborn remnant of a brutal Canadian winter that refuses to yield to the coming spring. On Saturday, March 16, 1946, the city of Hamilton was shrouded in this familiar damp chill, its industrial smokestacks painting the grey sky with thick, heavy plumes of soot. For 5 young boys, the biting temperature was merely an afterthought, an insignificance compared to the allure of freedom that the weekend promised. They had left the rows of brick houses and the hum of the city behind, seeking adventure in the rugged, wooded expanses near Albion Falls. The escarpment, a massive limestone ridge cutting through the landscape, loomed over the city like a silent titan, its steep slopes covered in patches of dirty, melting snow and dense thickets of barren trees. The boys moved with the chaotic energy of youth, their heavy boots crunching against the frozen mud, their breath pluming in white clouds as they laughed, shouted, and threw stones into the ravines. They were hunting for whatever treasures the woods might offer, perhaps a lost tool, an old rusted relic, or merely the thrill of conquering the treacherous, slippery paths that wound down toward the roaring waters of the falls. As they neared a secluded clearing, away from the main trails where the brush grew thick and tangled, the youngest of the group spotted something unusual resting at the base of a steep incline. It was a bulky, misshapen parcel, partially concealed by the dead leaves and winter debris, wrapped tightly in burlap and coarse sacking that had grown damp and stained from the melting frost. To the imaginative minds of young boys, a hidden bundle in the woods was an immediate spark for fantasies of buried loot or forgotten smuggler caches. They scrambled down the slope, sliding on the slick mud, their laughter echoing through the quiet valley as they crowded around the object. One of them reached out with a sturdy branch, prodding the heavy mass, expecting the hollow thud of discarded clothes or the crunch of old rubbish. Instead, the object shifted with a heavy, dead weight, and as the rough fabric tore slightly against the sharp twigs, a scent escaped into the cold air. It was not the clean, earthy smell of decaying forest loam, but something thick, metallic, and profoundly wrong. Curiosity quickly turned to hesitation as the eldest boy stepped forward, kneeling in the damp dirt to pull back a loose flap of the coarse burlap. The laughter died instantly in their throats, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing silence that seemed to freeze the very wind around them. Resting within the stained cloth was a human torso, raw and grotesquely severed. There was no head to cry out, no arms to defend, and no legs to run. It was a stark, pale trunk of flesh, cleanly and methodically butchered, the edges of the wounds white and bloodless from the freezing temperatures that had acted as a natural, grim refrigerator. The sheer asymmetry of the sight, the absolute violation of the human form, struck the boys not with immediate understanding, but with a primal, visceral terror. For a long moment, nobody breathed, nobody moved, their eyes locked onto the horrific centerpiece of the quiet woods. Then, as if waking from a collective nightmare, the boys turned and fled up the escarpment, their boots slipping, their lungs burning, their panicked screams cutting through the silent Hamilton afternoon as they ran toward the safety of the nearest road. Leaving behind a discovery that would forever shatter the illusion of post-war peace in their city. When the first police cruisers arrived at the scene, their tires spraying gravel against the brush, the seasoned detectives who stepped out expected the usual grim realities of their profession, perhaps a tragic suicide or the hidden casualty of a back-alley brawl. But as they descended into the ravine and stood over the burlap bundle, the atmosphere shifted into something far more sinister. The investigators, men who had seen the worst of Hamilton's industrial underworld, found themselves staring at a level of calculation that defied ordinary violence. This was not a crime of passion left to rot in panic, it was a cold, deliberate dissection. The lack of limbs and a head meant the killer had possessed either the anatomical knowledge or the chilling resolve to reduce a human being into an unidentifiable mass of flesh, a blank slate designed to confound the law. As the photographer's bulbs flashed, casting harsh, artificial light against the pale skin of the torso, the medical examiners began their grim preliminary work in the fading afternoon light. They carefully turned the heavy trunk over, noting the precision of the cuts at the joints, a detail that suggested the use of a heavy saw and a steady hand. But the killer, for all their calculated cruelty, had left behind clues etched into the very flesh they sought to anonymize. The detectives traced their fingers over a distinct, healed surgical scar running across the abdomen, an old vestige of a past medical battle. Further examination revealed a subtle, congenital deformity in the structure of the spine and pelvis, a unique physical signature that no amount of butchery could erase. These were not anonymous markings, they were a biological map, a fingerprint left by time and nature on a body that had once possessed a name, a voice, and a life. In the police headquarters downtown, The missing persons logs were quickly frantically flipped through, the teletype machines clacking against the linoleum floors as investigators cross-referenced the physical anomalies with the city's recent disappearances. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently collide when a report from a few days prior caught the detective's eye. John Dick, a 39-year-old local streetcar driver, a man known for his predictable routines and unremarkable life, had vanished without a trace. When the medical records of the missing driver were retrieved from the local hospital, the matching details were undeniable. The surgical scar, the pelvic irregularity, the height and build all aligned with terrifying precision. The torso in the woods belonged to John Dick. The realization sent a shockwave through the department, transforming a macabre discovery into an active, high-stakes hunt for a monster hidden in plain sight. John Dick was not a gangster or a drifter, he was a civil servant, a face familiar to hundreds of commuters who boarded his streetcar every morning. Who would want to erase such a man so completely from the earth, and what kind of hatred could fuel an act of such industrial-scale butchery? As the news of the Hamilton Torso murder burst onto the front pages of the local newspapers, the city was gripped by a collective fascination and horror. The sensational headlines screamed from the kiosks, and the residents of the working-class neighborhoods spoke of little else over their fences and in the smoky taverns. Yet, as the police began to peel back the layers of John Dick's life, they found themselves stepping away from the gritty streets of the factories and into a labyrinth of deception that led straight to the door of a prominent, yet deeply troubled household. The focus of the investigation narrowed with astonishing speed onto the victim's young wife, Evelyn Dick, a 25-year-old woman whose ethereal beauty and striking presence stood in sharp, unsettling contrast to the grim reality of the morgue. Evelyn was a creature of myth in the local social circles, a woman who seemed to glide through life on a cloud of expensive perfumes, clad in fine furs and tailored dresses that her husband's modest streetcar salary could never have afforded. To see her was to see a woman who belonged in the high society salons of Toronto or New York, not in a modest home on Carrick Avenue. But beneath the polished veneer of high fashion and captivating smiles lay a family history steeped in dysfunction, manipulation, and a ruthless ambition that bordered on the sociopathic. Evelyn was the product of a home where love was measured in dollars and beauty was a currency to be traded for power. Her father, Donald McLean, was a man of respected position but hollow character, working as an official for the very streetcar company that employed John Dick, using his position to embezzle thousands of dollars to fund his daughter's insatiable appetite for luxury. Her mother, a cold and calculating matriarch, had raised Evelyn to view men not as partners, but as targets, stepping stones to be used, drained, and discarded. Evelyn had learned her lessons well, admitting to an entourage of lovers that numbered in the scores, including some of the most influential political and business figures in the city, men who visited her in the shadows and paid handsomely for her discretion and her company. When she had married John Dick just a year prior, it was a union born not of affection, but of a catastrophic miscalculation. Evelyn had believed the quiet, older driver possessed hidden wealth, a secret fortune that she could exploit. When the marriage certificate dried and she realized the grim truth that John was merely a working man with nothing but his weekly paycheck, the illusion shattered. The fairy tale turned into a prison of resentment. Evelyn immediately abandoned the marital bed, retreating back to her parents' sphere of influence and resuming her predatory social life, leaving John a humiliated, broken man. But John Dick, driven by despair and a growing sense of betrayal, had recently uncovered the dark financial secrets of the McLean household, discovering the massive embezzlement scheme perpetrated by his father-in-law. In the days leading up to his disappearance, John had threatened to expose the entire family to the authorities, a move that would have brought their fragile empire of cards crashing down around them. The motive was clear, a toxic cocktail of greed, exposure, and social ruin. The beautiful, enigmatic widow was no longer just a grieving spouse, she was the central figure in a web of murder that threatened to drag the highest echelons of Hamilton society into the mud. The transition from a missing person inquiry to a capital murder investigation turned the modest house at 32, Carrick Avenue into a theater of forensic scrutiny. When the detectives knocked on the door, they were met not by a hysterical widow, but by a calm, almost detached Evelyn Dick, her composure unruffled by the gravity of the accusations swirling around her. But the house itself would speak the truths that Evelyn sought to conceal. As the investigators moved through the rooms, the air felt heavy, pregnant with secrets. The breakthrough came when a team of officers focused their attention on Evelyn's sleek, luxurious Packard automobile, a vehicle far beyond the means of a streetcar driver's wife. When they popped the trunk and illuminated the interior of the backseat, the beam of their flashlights caught a horrific sight. The dark fabric of the upholstery was stiffened and stained with massive, deep red crusted patches. It was blood, and it was everywhere, soaked deep into the fibers of the cushions, a silent testament to a violent struggle or the transport of a freshly slaughtered body. The forensic trail led from the driveway down into the dark, damp confines of the basement. The air down there was cold, smelling of stale soot and old ash. An investigator knelt before the large coal-burning furnace, his hands covered in heavy grime as he opened the iron door. Sifting through the grey, powdery remnants of past fires, his trowel struck something hard and unyielding. With meticulous care, the police pulled from the ashes a collection of charred, fragmented bones and several human teeth that had survived the intense heat. The implication was clear and devastating. John Dick's head and limbs had not been lost in the woods, they had been systematically fed into the furnace of his own wife's home, incinerated in a desperate attempt to erase his identity. But the horror of Carrick Avenue had not yet reached its peak. Driven by a grim instinct, a detective climbed the creaking wooden stairs to the dark, forgotten expanses of the attic. The space was dusty, filled with the discarded remnants of a wealthy life. In a dark corner, beneath a layer of cobwebs, sat a battered, heavy leather suitcase. When the detective unlatched the rusty buckles and lifted the lid, he did not find old clothes or letters. Instead, he was greeted by the sight of a solid block of grey, hardened cement. Embedded deep within that crude tomb was the mummified, tiny body of a newborn infant. The investigation had fractured wide open, revealing that the beautiful Evelyn Dick was not just a suspected Black Widow, but a mother who had literally cast her own flesh and blood into a block of stone. The revelation sent shockwaves through the legal system, setting the stage for a series of trials that would challenge the boundaries of Canadian justice, as a brilliant lawyer prepared to battle the state for the life of a woman who had become the most despised, yet fascinating figure in the nation. To understand the dark, labyrinthine depths of the Hamilton torso murder, one must first step back from the blood-soaked basement of Carrick Avenue and immerse themselves in the unique, suffocating atmosphere of Hamilton, Ontario, in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. In 1946, Hamilton was a city divided by its own geography and its rigid social structures, a place where the physical landscape mirrored the stark divisions between the classes. Below the towering, ancient limestone cliffs of the Niagara Escarpment lay the industrial heart of the city, a sprawling, gritty landscape dominated by the massive smokestacks of Stelco and Dofasco. Day and night, these steel mills belched thick, sulphurous plumes of black and orange smoke into the sky, coating the rows of modest, brick workers' cottages in a perpetual layer of fine, grey soot. This lower city was a world of relentless noise, the rhythmic, deafening thud of heavy machinery, the screech of iron wheels on streetcar tracks, and the weary chatter of thousands of European immigrants and working-class families who labored in the heat of the furnaces to build a prosperous post-war Canada. Life here was measured in shifts, weekly paychecks, and the quiet dignity of hard, physical labor, where neighbors watched out for one another and adherence to traditional morality was both a survival mechanism and a social expectation. But if one ascended the steep, winding mountain roads or rode the mechanical inclines to the top of the escarpment, the world transformed completely. The air above the mountain was crisp and clean, untouched by the toxic breath of the factories below. Here, nestled among manicured lawns, grand oak trees, and wide, quiet boulevards, stood the opulent estates of Hamilton's ruling class, the industrial barons, prominent lawyers, and wealthy politicians who controlled the city's destiny from their high perches. In this upper world, appearance was everything, wealth was flaunted with calculated elegance, and the grim realities of the factories below were treated as a distant, necessary abstraction. It was within this deeply divided social ecosystem, where the desperate desire to escape the soot of the lower city competed constantly with the rigid, hypocritical morality of the upper class, that Evelyn McLean was born and raised. a child destined to navigate and ultimately shatter the fragile boundaries between these two worlds. From her earliest years, Evelyn was a girl who commanded attention, possessing a striking, ethereal beauty that seemed almost out of place in her family's comfortable but decidedly middle-class home. Her father, Donald McLean, was a man of respectable standing in the community, working as a trusted clerk and financial official for the Hamilton Street Railway Company, the very lifeline that transported the city's working class to and from the factories. To the outside world, the McLeans were a model of Presbyterian rectitude, a pious, hard-working family that attended church and maintained a spotless reputation. But behind the closed doors of their home, a far more twisted and dysfunctional reality was playing out, a toxic domestic environment that would fundamentally warp Evelyn's developing psyche. Donald McLean was a man hollowed out by a deep, unspoken resentment, an individual who craved a life of luxury and high social status that his legitimate salary could never provide. He was also a man enslaved to the bottle, his respectable public persona dissolving in the evenings into bouts of alcohol-fueled rage and unpredictable volatility. His wife, a cold, calculating woman whose ambition far outstripped her morality, did not seek to curb her husband's darkness. Instead, she focused her formidable energies on her daughter, viewing Evelyn's exceptional physical beauty not as a gift to be nurtured, but as a highly valuable asset to be weaponized. From the time Evelyn was a young teenager, her mother systematically drilled into her a ruthless philosophy of life, teaching her that men were essentially weak, predatory creatures who existed solely to be manipulated and milked for financial gain. Love, affection, and loyalty were dismissed as foolish, dangerous illusions that only led to poverty and despair. Evelyn was taught to look at her own reflection in the mirror and see a key that could unlock the heavy, gilded doors of the mountain estates, a tool to carve out a life of absolute luxury regardless of the human cost. As Evelyn matured into her late teens and early 20s, she became a hypnotic presence in Hamilton's nightlife, a woman who seemed to instinctively understand the power she held over the opposite sex. She possessed a mane of dark, lustrous hair that framed a pale, porcelain face, punctuated by large, heavy-lidded eyes that could shift from a gaze of innocent vulnerability to one of calculating coldness in a single heartbeat. She dressed with an extravagant, theatrical flair that defied her family's actual income, draped in expensive silks, fine furs, and tailored wool coats that made her stand out like a vibrant tropical bird in the grey, soot-stained streets of the city. Evelyn quickly learned how to navigate the complicated waters of male desire, transforming herself into a high-class courtesan for Hamilton's elite. She moved effortlessly between the shadows of the lower city's private clubs and the secluded lounges of the upper mountain, attracting an entourage of wealthy, powerful lovers that included prominent businessmen, influential city officials, and respected married politicians who were willing to pay astronomical sums for her companionship and, more importantly, her silence. Evelyn took a dark, secret pleasure in this double life, reveling in the knowledge that the very men who preached morality from the city pulpits and council chambers were begging for her favors in the dark. She admitted to acquaintances, with a chilling lack of emotion, that she had been intimate with well over 100 men, viewing each encounter not as a sin or a romantic connection, but as a simple, transactional business arrangement. Her father, Donald McLean, far from being outraged by his daughter's behavior, actively enabled and encouraged her lifestyle, using his position at the streetcar company to systematically embezzle thousands of dollars to help finance the wardrobe, the jewelry, and the expensive Packard automobile that Evelyn required to maintain her high society illusion. The McLean household became a cooperative criminal enterprise, fueled by stolen money and sexual manipulation, all hidden behind a facade of bourgeois respectability. Yet, for all her calculated schemes and high-profile conquests, Evelyn's life was an unstable, chaotic vortex that constantly threatened to spin out of control. The money that flowed through her hands from her father's thefts and her lover's pockets disappeared as quickly as it arrived, swallowed up by her insatiable appetite for high-stakes gambling, expensive trips, and a reckless, fast-paced lifestyle that left her constantly teetering on the edge of financial ruin. Her reputation, despite her family's best efforts to maintain a veneer of decency, began to curdle into a subject of salacious gossip in the neighborhood, with whispers of illegitimate pregnancies and hidden scandals trailing behind her like the scent of her expensive French perfume. It was during one of these periods of intense financial pressure and mounting social desperation, in the middle of 1945 as the war was drawing to a close, that Evelyn's path intersected with that of John Dick. To understand the tragedy that followed, one must realize how completely mismatched these two individuals were, their union a collision of pure deception and tragic naivety. John Dick was a 39-year-old Scotsman, a quiet, unassuming man with a weathered face and a gentle demeanor who had spent years working diligently as a driver for the Hamilton Street Railway. John was the absolute antithesis of the wealthy, sophisticated men Evelyn usually targeted. He was a simple, working-class bachelor who lived a frugal, predictable life, saving his hard-earned money and dreaming of finding a beautiful, respectable woman to settle down with in a peaceful home away from the noise of the world. When he first laid eyes on Evelyn as she boarded his streetcar, he was instantly, hopelessly smitten, blinded by her Hollywood-style glamour and the deceptive warmth she directed toward him. Evelyn, looking for a quick escape from her mounting debts and a respectable name to shield her from the growing whispers in the city, played the part of the lonely, refined young woman to perfection, allowing John to court her with an old-fashioned chivalry that she secretly despised. The deception deepened when Evelyn, masterfully manipulating John's desire to protect her, dropped subtle, calculated hints that she was the beneficiary of a massive, secret trust fund from a wealthy relative, an illusion supported by the expensive lifestyle her father's embezzlement continued to fund. John, naive and unfamiliar with the dark undercurrents of the McLean family, genuinely believed he had found a wealthy, high-society heiress who loved him for his honesty and work ethic. For Evelyn, the marriage was supposed to be the ultimate con, a way to secure a stable, respectable husband while continuing to exploit what she assumed was John's own hidden savings, which she believed he had accumulated over his decades of steady employment. They were married in a hasty, quiet ceremony that autumn, but the honeymoon was short-lived, as the heavy veil of mutual misunderstanding was violently torn away almost immediately after the wedding vows were exchanged. When Evelyn moved into the modest home they were to share, she demanded to see John's bank accounts, expecting to find the fortune she had imagined. Instead, she was confronted with the stark, undeniable reality of a working man's ledger, a modest sum that could barely cover the cost of a single one of her fur coats. The realization that she had married a poor streetcar driver, that she was now legally tied to the very working-class soot she had spent her entire life trying to escape, filled Evelyn with a towering, venomous rage. She realized she had been conned by her own greed, trapped in a marriage to a man she considered beneath her, a man whose presence was a constant, humiliating reminder of her own failure. The illusion of the beautiful heiress dissolved in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating malice that would soon transform the quiet streets of Hamilton into the stage for a horror story that no one in the city would ever forget. To paint a true portrait of John Dick, one must step away from the sensational, macabre headlines that later reduced him to a nameless torso and look instead at the flesh-and-blood man who walked the streets of Hamilton with a quiet dignity. Born in Scotland, John carried within him the deeply ingrained values of his homeland, a stubborn work ethic, a fierce sense of personal honesty, and a reserved, polite demeanor that won him the respect of everyone he encountered. When he immigrated to Canada, he brought nothing but his 2 hands and a determination to build a stable, respectable life in the new world. He found his calling on the tracks of the Hamilton Street Railway, becoming a streetcar driver, a position that, in the 1930s and 1940s, was far more than just a job, it was a vital public service. Day after day, year after year, in the freezing depths of Canadian winters and the sweltering heat of July, John sat at the controls of his iron car, navigating the bustling, soot-heavy corridors of the lower city. He was a fixture in the daily lives of thousands of Hamilton workers, a man who greeted every passenger with a warm, genuine smile and a tipped hat. His regular commuters knew him as a dependable, gentle soul who would often hold the doors for a running late-shift factory worker or offer a kind word to a tired mother struggling with her groceries. John was a man of simple pleasures, completely untainted by the cynical ambitions that drove the wealthy elite of the mountain estates. He lived a frugal, orderly life in a modest rooming house, meticulously saving his hard-earned dollars, maintaining his uniforms with pride, and dreaming of the day he would find a good, honest woman to share a home with. He was a man who believed in the fundamental goodness of people and the sanctity of the law, a naive worldview that left him completely defenseless against the predatory monsters waiting in the shadows. When John first crossed paths with Evelyn McLean, it was as if a creature from a glossy Hollywood magazine had suddenly stepped into his mundane, predictable world. He was 39 years old, a bachelor who had spent most of his life focusing on his duty, and his heart was utterly unprepared for the intoxicating whirlwind that Evelyn unleashed upon him. She was 25, radiant, and possessed a sophisticated charm that completely disarmed the older Scotsman. When she boarded his streetcar, her expensive perfume filling the damp air of the driver's cabin, and cast her large, dark eyes in his direction, John was instantly, helplessly blinded. To him, Evelyn was not just a beautiful young woman, she was the embodiment of everything he had ever hoped to achieve: grace, refinement, and a higher tier of life. Evelyn, practicing the cruel arts of manipulation her mother had taught her, quickly realized that John was a man of absolute sincerity, making him the perfect target for her latest deception. She presented herself to him as a lonely, misunderstood heiress, a refined girl trapped in a strict household, who longed for the protection of a strong, honest, hard-working man. John's natural chivalry was deeply stirred. He felt a fierce, protective instinct rise within him, believing it was his duty to rescue this delicate, wealthy angel from her troubles. He began to court her with an old-fashioned, respectful devotion, spending his savings on small gifts and dinners, completely oblivious to the fact that his every move was being analyzed by a calculating predator who was sizing up his potential worth. The tragedy of John Dick lay in the absolute purity of his intentions, a stark contrast to the venomous web of lies that was being woven tightly around him by the entire McLean family. When they were married in the autumn of 1945, John believed he was stepping into a fairy tale, entering into a sacred covenant with a woman who loved him for his character. He dreamed of a quiet, peaceful home filled with laughter and the warmth of a real family. But the illusion did not just fade. It was violently, ruthlessly torn away within days of the wedding ceremony. When Evelyn demanded to see his financial books, expecting to find the hidden fortune she had imagined, and was instead confronted with the modest savings of a public transit worker, her face transformed from that of a loving bride into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She did not just express disappointment, she unleashed a torrent of abuse upon John, mocking his accent, his job, and his social standing, making it clear that she viewed him as nothing more than a pathetic, lower-class peasant who had dared to touch her. Evelyn immediately abandoned the marriage, refusing to share his bed and returning to her parents' home on Carrick Avenue, leaving John completely shattered, stranded in an empty house with a mountain of debts from the wedding and a broken heart that he could not begin to understand. Despite the humiliation and the cruel rejection, John's deep-seated sense of duty and his stubborn Scottish pride refused to let him simply walk away. He spent the winter of 1945 and the early weeks of 1946 wandering the streets of Hamilton like a ghost, trying desperately to reconcile the beautiful woman he had married with the cold, heartless stranger who now refused to look at him. In his desperation to understand what had gone wrong, John began to closely observe the McLean household, and it was during this period of painful vigilance that his eyes were finally opened to the horrific truth. Because of his own job at the streetcar company, John began to notice glaring irregularities in the financial transactions managed by his father-in-law, Donald McLean. He realized that the luxurious lifestyle the family enjoyed, the fine furs, the expensive dinners, and the very Packard automobile that Evelyn drove was not funded by an old family trust, but by a massive, systematic embezzlement scheme that Donald was running against the Hamilton Street Railway Company. John discovered that the family was a hollow shell built on stolen money and criminal collusion. For a man of John's rigid honesty, this discovery was a profound shock that transformed his grief into a righteous, burning anger. He realized he had been used as a shield, a respectable name to hide a family of thieves. In the weeks leading up to March 1946, John confronted Evelyn and her father, his voice trembling with a mixture of betrayal and resolve as he demanded that they make things right. Threatening to take the evidence he had gathered straight to the police and the directors of the company if they did not comply. By doing so, John Dick, the quiet, gentle streetcar driver who had only ever wanted a home and a family, unknowingly signed his own death warrant, placing himself directly in the path of a desperate, ruthless family that would stop at nothing. Not even the complete butcher-like erasure of a human life, to protect their dirty secrets. The early days of March 1946 brought no warmth to the industrial streets of Hamilton, only a cruel, damp fog that rolled off Lake Ontario and smothered the city in a grey, suffocating blanket. For John Dick, the chill seemed to penetrate deep into his bones, a physical manifestation of the heavy, dark dread that had settled over his life since he had delivered his ultimatum to the McLean family. He moved through his shifts on the streetcar like a man walking through a nightmare, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights, his mind constantly racing as he replayed the venomous looks his father-in-law, Donald McLean, had cast his way during their last confrontation. John knew he was playing a dangerous game with desperate people, but his rigid sense of honesty left him no alternative. He could not and would not allow himself to be a passive accomplice to a family of thieves and manipulators. On the afternoon of March 6, 1946, as his shift drew to a close and the factory whistles began to blow across the lower city, signaling the end of another grueling day for Hamilton's working class, John received a message that caused his heart to skip a beat. It was a summons from Evelyn, a brief, unexpectedly soft request for him to meet her, suggesting that perhaps they could finally talk things through, resolve their differences, and find a way out of the bitter impasse that was destroying them both. Despite every instinct shouting at him to stay away, despite the memory of her cruel scorns and the chilling detachment she had shown him, the faint, tragic ember of hope that still burned in John's chest compelled him to agree. He wanted to believe that the woman he had loved was still in there somewhere, that she was capable of redemption, and so he walked blindly into the trap that had been meticulously prepared for him in the shadows of the lower city. The meeting was set not at the respectable McLean home on Carrick Avenue, but in a secluded, quiet location where the presence of a Packard automobile would not draw the eyes of nosy neighbors. When John stepped into the back seat of the luxurious car, expecting a difficult conversation or perhaps tears of regret, the atmosphere inside the vehicle instantly froze the blood in his veins. Evelyn was there, sitting in the front, her pale face completely devoid of emotion, her large, dark eyes staring straight ahead into the grey fog, refusing to look back at the man who had once thought he was her husband. Before John could even utter a word of greeting, the doors clicked shut, and from the shadows of the vehicle, the figures of Donald McLean and Evelyn's secret lover emerged with a violent, terrifying suddenness. There was no argument, no final plea for mercy, and no opportunity for John to defend himself against the coordinated fury of his attackers. A heavy, blunt object swung through the dim interior of the car, connecting with John's skull with a sickening, muffled thud that shattered his consciousness and sent him slumping into the heavy fabric of the upholstery. The back seat of the Packard became a claustrophobic chamber of pure, unadulterated violence as the attackers, driven by a panicked, savage desperation to protect their secrets, unleashed a brutal assault on the defenseless, unconscious driver. Ensuring that the voice that had threatened to ruin their fragile empire would be silenced forever. The car then sped away through the dark, fog-choked streets of Hamilton, its tires humming softly against the wet pavement, carrying a cargo of death toward the quiet house on Carrick Avenue where the true horror of the night was about to unfold. When the Packard pulled into the dark driveway of 32, Carrick Avenue, the house stood silent and imposing in the midnight chill, a respectable middle-class facade hiding the monstrous work that was about to begin within its walls. The heavy, limp body of John Dick was dragged from the blood-soaked back seat and carried down the steep, creaking wooden stairs into the pitch-black, freezing confines of the basement. The air down there was thick with the smell of old coal dust, rust, and damp earth, a fitting stage for a crime that defied the very boundaries of human decency. Donald McLean and his accomplices stood over the body in the dim light of a single, bare overhead bulb, their breathing heavy, their faces slick with sweat and panic as they looked at the physical evidence of their crime. They realized that a simple murder would not be enough. John was a well-known fixture in the city, a man whose disappearance would immediately trigger a massive police investigation. To escape the noose, they needed to make John Dick disappear entirely from the face of the earth, to reduce him to something that could never be identified, never connected back to the house on Carrick Avenue. With a cold, systematic detachment that belonged in a slaughterhouse rather than a family home, they reached for the tools of destruction, a heavy, sharp butcher's saw and a set of long, professional knives, their iron blades gleaming dully under the pale electric light. The hours that followed were a descent into an absolute, stomach-churning nightmare as the basement of the McLean home was transformed into an industrial killing floor. The heavy, rhythmic sound of the saw cutting through bone and muscle echoed softly through the floorboards of the quiet house, a horrific metronome that marked the steady erasure of a human being. With a chilling precision that suggested either a background in butchery or a terrifyingly focused resolve, the killers severed John's arms at the shoulders and his legs at the hips, reducing the tall, proud Scotsman into a raw, anonymous trunk of flesh. But the most grotesque act of the night was reserved for the head, the seat of John's identity, the face that had smiled at so many commuters on the Hamilton streetcars. The head was severed from the neck, its features marred by the violence of the initial attack, leaving a smooth, bloodless wound that the freezing air of the basement quickly stilled. As the floor became slick with deep red pools, the killers realized that disposing of the limbs and head required a method that would leave absolutely no trace for the police to find. They turned their attention to the massive, iron coal-burning furnace that sat in the corner of the basement, its wide doors yawning open like the mouth of a subterranean beast. They stoked the fire until the iron walls of the furnace glowed with a dull, angry heat, the roar of the flames filling the small basement with a suffocating, oppressive warmth. One by one, the severed limbs and the head of John Dick were lifted from the blood-stained concrete floor and fed into the roaring inferno. The smell of burning flesh and hair rose up through the chimney, drifting out into the cold, midnight air of Hamilton, a sickening, sweet stench that dissipated unnoticed into the industrial smog of the city's factories. The killers stood before the open furnace for hours, using long iron pokers to stir the embers, ensuring that the high heat consumed every shred of muscle, every fragment of bone, and every single tooth, transforming the head that had known the secrets of their crimes into a pile of grey, faceless ash. Yet, as the morning sun began to crack through the dirty basement windows, painting the crimson-stained walls in strips of pale light, the killers were left with a final, heavy problem. The torso, the large, dense central mass of the body, was too bulky to be entirely consumed by the home furnace without drawing the attention of the neighbors through hours of thick, black smoke. Panicked by the approaching daylight, they wrapped the heavy, pale trunk of flesh tightly in old burlap bags and coarse sacking, securing it with rough twine, and loaded the macabre parcel back into the blood-stained trunk of the Packard, preparing to drive out toward the remote, rugged wilderness of the escarpment to discard the final, damning evidence of their horrific deed. The morning of Saturday, March 16, 1946, began like any other late winter day in the industrial city of Hamilton, with a heavy, leaden sky that seemed to rest on the very tops of the factory smokestacks. The air was thick with the scent of sulfur and coal dust, a familiar perfume to the thousands of working-class families who lived in the shadow of the great steel mills. For 5 young boys, however, the grim atmosphere of the lower city was something to be escaped, a boundary to be crossed in search of the wild, untamed spaces that lay atop the Niagara escarpment. They had spent the early hours of the weekend gathering their courage, wrapping their woolen scarves tightly around their necks, and setting out toward the rugged terrain near Albion Falls, a place where the city's concrete gave way to deep ravines, thick brush, and the roaring voice of the water cascading over the ancient limestone cliffs. To these children, the woods were a kingdom of endless possibilities, a landscape where they could play at being explorers, hunters, or soldiers returning from the Great War that had ended only a year prior. They moved with a chaotic, infectious energy, their heavy leather boots crunching against the frozen mud and patches of dirty, melting snow that clung stubbornly to the shaded slopes of the mountain. Their laughter echoed through the quiet valley, their breath pluming into white clouds as they chased one another down the slippery, treacherous paths that wound along the edge of the deep ravines. As the midday sun tried and failed to pierce the dense layer of gray clouds, the boys found themselves wandering away from the main trails, drawn by the allure of a particularly steep and overgrown incline where the brush grew thick and tangled. It was a secluded spot, a place where the discarded remnants of the city occasionally washed up after a heavy rain, and the children immediately began to search the ground for any hidden treasures that might have been left behind by careless hikers or forgotten by time. It was the youngest of the group, a boy of barely 10 years old, who suddenly stopped his scrambling, his eyes locking onto an unusual shape resting near the base of a massive, ancient oak tree. Partially buried beneath a layer of rotting winter leaves and broken branches sat a bulky, misshapen parcel, its true form concealed by several layers of coarse, stained burlap and rough sacking that had grown damp and heavy from the melting frost. To the imaginative mind of a child, a hidden bundle in the deep woods could only mean one thing: a secret cache left behind by thieves, or perhaps a collection of valuable tools that had been abandoned in a hurry. The boy shouted to his companions, his voice shrill with excitement as he pointed toward the discovery, and within seconds, the other 4 children came sliding down the muddy slope, their previous games forgotten as they crowded around the mysterious object. The eldest boy, sensing the responsibility of his age, stepped forward and prodded the heavy mass with a long, sturdy branch he had been using as a walking stick, expecting the hollow, yielding rustle of old clothes or the sharp crunch of discarded household rubbish. Instead, the branch struck something dense, solid, and unnaturally heavy, causing the bundle to shift slightly with a dead, unresponsive weight that immediately dampened the boy's excitement. As the rough fabric of the burlap tore slightly against a sharp, protruding twig, a sudden, suffocating odor escaped into the crisp, biting air, a thick, metallic stench that was completely alien to the clean, earthy smell of the forest loam. It was an odor that bypassed the intellect and struck directly at the boys' primal instincts, a scent of profound wrongness that caused them to take a collective step backward, their laughter dying instantly in their throats. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant, muffled roar of Albion Falls and the caw of a solitary crow circling high above the barren treetops. Driven by a mixture of morbid curiosity and a growing dread, the eldest boy knelt in the damp mud, his hand trembling as he reached out and carefully pulled back a loose, stained flap of the heavy burlap sacking. The sight that greeted the children's eyes was a vision of pure, unadulterated horror that would remain etched into their minds for the rest of their days, a grotesque violation of the human form that defied their understanding of reality. Resting within the damp cloth was a human torso, a pale, thick trunk of flesh that had been methodically and brutally severed at the neck, the shoulders, and the hips. There was no head to give the object a face, no arms to suggest a gesture of defense, and no legs to indicate a path taken. It was simply a raw, butcher-like fragment of a human being, reduced to a piece of meat and discarded like trash in the wilderness. The edges of the wounds were clean, white, and bloodless, a grim indication that the freezing temperatures of the Hamilton winter had acted as a natural refrigerator, preserving the macabre evidence and preventing the natural processes of decay from reclaiming the flesh. The sheer asymmetry of the object, the absolute erasure of identity, struck the boys not with a desire to investigate further, but with a sudden, paralyzing terror that seemed to freeze the very blood in their veins. For a long, agonizing moment, they stood frozen on the muddy slope, their eyes locked onto the horrific centerpiece of the quiet woods, unable to comprehend the depth of the malice required to create such a thing. Then, as if a single wire had snapped within their minds, the boys turned and fled up the steep incline, their boots slipping on the slick mud, their lungs burning as they screamed for help. Their panicked voices cutting through the silent afternoon air as they ran blindly toward the safety of the nearest road. When the first police cruisers arrived at the edge of the woods, their tires spraying gravel against the brush as they came to a halt, the seasoned detectives who stepped out into the cold air expected to find the tragic but mundane aftermath of a local accident or a desperate suicide. But as they followed the trembling boys back down into the ravine and stood over the burlap-wrapped package, the atmosphere among the officers shifted from professional detachment to a grim, heavy foreboding. The lead investigators, men who had spent decades dealing with the grit and violence of Hamilton's industrial underbelly, found themselves staring at a level of calculation that went far beyond anything they had ever encountered. This was not a crime of passion left to rot in a moment of panic, it was a cold, deliberate dissection, an act of anatomical butchery designed specifically to confound the law and ensure that the victim would remain forever anonymous. The crime scene investigators immediately went to work, their heavy boots tramping down the surrounding brush as they set up their tripods and prepared their equipment under the rapidly fading afternoon light. The harsh, artificial flash of the camera bulbs exploded against the grey landscape, casting long, dancing shadows through the barren trees and illuminating the pale, cold skin of the torso with a stark, clinical brilliance that only heightened the horror of the scene. The medical examiners knelt in the damp dirt, their gloved hands moving with a professional reverence as they began their preliminary examination of the heavy trunk of flesh, looking for any marking, any shred of evidence that could give a name back to the faceless dead. As they carefully turned the torso over, noting the clean precision of the bone cuts at the joints, they realized that the killer had possessed either a background in butchery or a chillingly steady hand that did not falter during the hours of dissection. But as the detectives brushed away the bits of forest debris and dried blood that clung to the skin, they discovered that the human body possesses a stubborn memory, a biological signature that no amount of systematic butchery can completely erase. Running across the pale skin of the abdomen was a distinct, heavily silvered surgical scar, the permanent remnant of a long-past medical operation that had saved the victim's life years before it was so violently taken. Furthermore, as the examiners measured the structure of the pelvis and the alignment of the lower spine, they detected a subtle, congenital deformity, a unique physical irregularity that would have affected the victim's gait and posture during life. These were not random markings, they were a biological map, a specific set of physical coordinates that belonged to only one man in the entire city of Hamilton, providing the police with the vital thread they needed to begin pulling at the fabric of this monstrous mystery. Back at the Central Police Headquarters downtown, the atmosphere was thick with tension as the teletype machines clacked relentlessly against the linoleum floors and the phones rang off their hooks with inquiries from the local press. The detectives sat under the glare of the overhead lights, their desks piled high with missing persons logs, frantically cross-referencing the physical anomalies found on the torso with the descriptions of recent disappearances from every neighborhood in the city. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered across the industrial landscape of the lower city, began to violently collide when an investigator pulled a report that had been filed just a few days prior, a routine inquiry that had initially garnered little attention. John Dick, a 39-year-old Scotsman who had spent years working as a dependable, quiet driver for the Hamilton Street Railway Company, had vanished without a trace, failing to show up for his scheduled shifts and leaving his modest rooming house untouched. When the detectives contacted the local hospital and retrieved John Dick's medical history, the details aligned with a terrifying, undeniable precision. The surgical records confirmed the exact location of the abdominal scar. And the company's employment physicals noted the subtle pelvic irregularity that matched the torso in the woods. The realization sent a profound shockwave through the entire department, transforming a macabre discovery in the ravine into an active, high-stakes hunt for a killer who was hiding in plain sight, a monster who had taken a familiar working-class public servant and reduced him to an anonymous mass of flesh in a desperate bid to hide a secret that was about to tear the city apart. The confirmation of the torso's identity as John Dick sent a jolt through the Hamilton police force, shifting the momentum of the investigation from a state of macabre speculation into a relentless, targeted manhunt. The detectives knew that to find the killer of a simple, orderly streetcar driver, they had to understand the company he kept and the friction that had entered his life in the months leading up to his disappearance. The initial dragnet cast a wide net across the lower city, with investigators descending upon the bustling car barns of the Hamilton Street Railway Company where John had spent his working hours. They interviewed his fellow drivers, conductors, and regular commuters, men with grease-stained caps and weary eyes who spoke of John with a genuine, quiet fondness, painting a portrait of a man who had no enemies, no gambling debts, and no involvement in the industrial underworld of the factories. But as the detectives pushed past the collective grief of John's co-workers, a consistent, unsettling detail began to emerge from the whispers, a shadow that had fallen over John's life ever since his whirlwind marriage to the beautiful, enigmatic Evelyn McLean. His friends recalled how John's cheerful demeanor had curdled into anxiety, how he had been seen wandering near the McLean residence on Carrick Avenue late at night, and how he had dropped dark hints about a massive betrayal that he was preparing to expose. With the spotlight firmly fixed on the McLean household, the police turned their attention to the initial circle of suspects, a task that quickly bogged down in a labyrinth of social prestige, political influence, and stone-cold denial. Evelyn Dick was summoned to the Central Police Station for questioning, stepping into the drab, smoke-filled interrogation room like a queen entering a minor court, her expensive fur coat draped elegantly over her shoulders, her pale face perfectly composed under a wide-brimmed hat. She did not weep, she did not panic. Instead, she spun a web of smooth, contradictory narratives that left the seasoned investigators spinning in circles. She claimed that she had not seen John for weeks, suggesting with a faint, dismissive shrug that her husband was a volatile, unpredictable man who had likely fled the city to escape his own mounting financial failures or perhaps to return to Scotland without warning. When the detectives pressed her on the rumors of her extensive network of wealthy lovers, Evelyn's eyes flashed with a calculated, dangerous amusement, and she masterfully dropped the names of prominent local industrialists, city councillors, and respected attorneys. A subtle but potent reminder that digging too deeply into her personal life would trigger a social earthquake that could ruin the careers of the very men who oversaw the police department's budget. This implicit threat created an immediate, suffocating gridlock within the investigation, as senior officials hesitated to authorize the aggressive tactics needed to break the case wide open, fearing the political fallout of dragging Hamilton's upper crust into a capital murder inquiry. The detectives found themselves hitting wall after wall of silence, as the wealthy men who frequented Evelyn's social circle suddenly developed collective amnesia, their high-priced lawyers delivering stern warnings to the police chief to keep their clients' names out of the newspapers. Meanwhile, the second major suspect, Donald McLean, presented his own formidable barrier to the truth. As a senior, trusted financial official within the streetcar company, McLean possessed a veneer of middle-class respectability that made the initial accusations against him seem preposterous to the city's conservative establishment. He met the detectives with a blustering, alcohol-scented outrage, claiming that his son-in-law was a low-class opportunist who had tried to blackmail his family after failing to secure a portion of their non-existent fortune. McLean's alibis for the week of the murder were dense, supported by the testimony of his submissive wife and a handful of drinking companions from his private clubs who swore they had seen him playing cards during the hours John Dick was believed to have been killed. As the first week of the investigation drew to a close, a sense of profound frustration and despair settled over the homicide squad, the initial breakthrough on the mountain fading into a grim realization that they were chasing ghosts through a fog of high society corruption. Every lead seemed to terminate in a dead end. The cause of the Crows over Albion Falls felt like a mockery of their lack of progress, and the local press began to grow restless. Printing scathing editorials that accused the police of coddling the wealthy and powerful while leaving the butchery of a working-class citizen unavenged. The detectives knew in their hearts that the answers lay within the walls of 32, Carrick Avenue, that the cool, beautiful widow and her volatile father were directly involved in the slaughter, but without concrete, undeniable physical evidence connecting the family to the actual act of murder. Any arrest warrant they submitted would be torn to pieces by the courts. They were trapped in an investigative wasteland, needing a miracle, a crack in the armor of the McLean family's arrogance, or a piece of forensic truth that no amount of political influence could suppress, before the Hamilton torso murder became just another cold, unsolved tragedy in the dark annals of the city's history. The thick, suffocating gridlock that had paralyzed the Hamilton homicide squad finally broke on a cold, drizzly morning when a young detective, acting on a stubborn gut instinct rather than a formal order, secured a comprehensive search warrant for the property at 32, Carrick Avenue. The atmosphere within the police department had grown desperate, but as the convoy of black police cruisers pulled up along the curb of the modest McLean neighborhood, the investigators moved with a quiet, lethal focus. Evelyn Dick watched from the parlor window, her pale face impassive, her long fingers idly tracing the rim of a porcelain teacup as the front door was forced open. The forensic team did not waste time with pleasantries. They bypassed the elegant furniture and the expensive oil paintings that Evelyn's illicit lifestyle had bought, descending instead into the dark, grease-scented driveway where her sleek Packard automobile sat parked. A senior technician clicked on a powerful inspection lamp, its harsh, blue-white beam slicing through the dimness of the garage as he opened the rear doors of the vehicle. When the light hit the deep blue fabric of the back seat, the room seemed to lose its oxygen. The material was heavily encrusted, stiffened, and stained with massive, overlapping patches of a deep, rusty crimson that had soaked straight through to the horsehair padding beneath. Preliminary chemical reagents sprayed onto the cloth reacted instantly, hissing and turning a brilliant, violent blue that confirmed the presence of an enormous quantity of human blood, a silent, damning testament that this luxury vehicle had been used as a mobile slaughterhouse. Leaving a guard over the car, the team moved with a grim, escalating momentum into the house itself, trailing the invisible scent of violence down the creaking wooden stairs and into the pitch-black, freezing confines of the basement. The air down there was thick with the suffocating smell of damp earth, old iron, and stale coal smoke, a subterranean vault that felt completely disconnected from the respectable middle-class street above. An investigator knelt before the massive, iron coal-burning furnace that dominated the corner of the room, his hands covered in heavy black grime as he wrenched open the heavy firebox door. Using a long steel trowel, he began to meticulously sift through the deep layers of gray, powdery ash and unburnt coal remnants that lay inside the belly of the furnace. His tool suddenly struck something hard and unyielding with a sharp, metallic click. Working with the delicate precision of an archaeologist uncovering an ancient burial site, the officer pulled from the debris a series of charred, fragile bone fragments, followed shortly by several human teeth that had managed to survive the intense, roaring heat of the incinerator. Forensic analysts standing in the dim light immediately identified the fragments as portions of a human skull and joint bones that had been deliberately broken and fed into the flames, providing the undeniable physical proof that John Dick's missing head and limbs had been systematically destroyed right beneath his wife's feet. The horror of Carrick Avenue, however, had not yet revealed its most monstrous secret, as the search party, driven by a collective, dark premonition, pushed their way back up the stairs to the highest, most forgotten level of the house. A detective climbed the steep ladder into the narrow, dust-choked expanse of the attic, his flashlight beam cutting through the dense cobwebs and disturbed insulation that covered the floorboards. In the furthest, darkest corner of the eaves, tucked away behind a stack of old magazines and discarded winter blankets, sat a battered, heavy leather suitcase, its brass buckles covered in a thick layer of green verdigris. The detective pulled the heavy case into the center of the room, his breath catching in his throat as he unclasped the rusty latches and lifted the stiff leather lid. Expecting to find more of John Dick's missing remains or perhaps the blood-stained clothes of the killers, the officers were instead greeted by the sight of a solid, gray, and completely uniform block of hardened industrial cement that filled the entire lower half of the suitcase. As the medical examiners carefully chiseled away the rough, crumbling edges of the concrete block in the laboratory hours later, the true depth of Evelyn Dick's depravity was laid bare before the horrified eyes of the law. Embedded deep within that crude, stone tomb was the perfectly mummified, fragile body of a newborn infant, its tiny features frozen in a silent, tragic scream of neglected innocence. The subsequent autopsy and a frantic review of local medical records identified the child as Peter David White, an illegitimate son whom Evelyn had secretly given birth to several years prior, a child she had publicly claimed to have given away to a wealthy adoptive family in another province. The realization that the beautiful, untouchable socialite was not only the architect of her husband's gruesome butcher-style execution but also the cold-blooded murderer of her own infant child shattered the last remnants of her defense, transforming the Hamilton torso murder from a localized crime of greed into an international sensation of unparalleled psychological darkness that would force the Canadian justice system to confront a level of evil it was entirely unprepared to handle. The courtroom inside the historic Wentworth County Courthouse was suffocatingly hot, packed to its absolute capacity with a restless, whispering crowd that had queued for hours in the damp morning chill just to catch a glimpse of the woman who had captivated and horrified the entire nation. When Evelyn Dick was led into the prisoner's dock by two matrons, a collective gasp rippled through the gallery, her appearance once again defying the grim reality of the accusations against her. She was dressed with her characteristic, meticulous elegance, wearing a tailored black suit that accentuated her pale, porcelain skin, her dark hair swept up neatly beneath a fashionable hat, and her large eyes surveying the room with a calm, almost aristocratic detachment that bordered on pure indifference. Opposite her sat the prosecution team, their desks piled high with the damning forensic evidence harvested from Carrick Avenue, including the blood-stained upholstery from the Packard and the jars containing the charred bone fragments retrieved from the furnace. The first trial, focusing solely on the capital murder of John Dick, began with a brilliant display of legal pageantry as the Crown prosecutor laid out a timeline of greed, manipulation, and systematic butchery that painted Evelyn not as a passive bystander, but as the cold-blooded director of a monstrous execution. Witnesses took the stand one by one, from the young boys who had stumbled upon the torso near Albion Falls to the forensic experts who described the industrial precision required to dissect a human frame, each testimony hammering another nail into the coffin of Evelyn's defense. Throughout the grueling weeks of the first trial, Evelyn's composure rarely fractured, even as her own previous statements to the police, a chaotic web of shifting alibis, desperate denials, and venomous finger-pointing at her father and her lovers, were read aloud to the jury, exposing her complete lack of empathy or remorse. The jury, comprised of working-class Hamilton men who had been deeply shaken by the brutal erasure of a fellow citizen, spent only a few hours deliberating before returning to the courtroom with a verdict that surprised no one: guilty of murder. When the judge, donning the traditional black cap, pronounced the sentence of death by hanging, a heavy silence fell over the room, yet Evelyn merely blinked, her face remaining a mask of icy calm as she was led away to the condemned cell, seemingly resigned to her fate on the gallows. But the machinery of Canadian justice was about to be thrown into a state of total chaos by the arrival of J.J. Robinette, a legendary, fiercely brilliant Toronto defense attorney who was hired to spearhead Evelyn's appeal. Robinette looked at the case not with the moral outrage of the public, but with the cold, analytical eye of a master legal tactician, identifying a series of critical procedural errors made by the police during their frantic initial interrogations of the suspect. At the appellate court in 1947, Robinette delivered a masterclass in constitutional law, arguing passionately and successfully that the highly incriminating statements Evelyn had given to the police were extracted through coercion, without proper legal warnings, and were therefore entirely inadmissible under the law. The appellate judges, bound by the strict tenets of legal precedent rather than emotional sentiment, agreed with Robinette's arguments, throwing out the original conviction and ordering a sensational second trial for the murder of John Dick. In this second proceeding, with the most damning confessions legally barred from the ears of the jury, the prosecution's case fractured, and in an outcome that stunned the public and triggered widespread outrage across the country, Evelyn Dick was officially acquitted of the murder of her husband, while her father, Donald McLean, was handed a mere 4-year sentence for his role as an accessory after the fact in disposing of the remains. The public's fury was palpable, but the Crown was not yet defeated. They immediately pivot to the second, hidden horror of the Carrick Avenue attic, putting Evelyn on trial for the murder of her infant son, Peter David White, whose tiny body had been found cast into a block of industrial cement inside the old leather suitcase. This final legal battle was a raw, deeply disturbing dive into Evelyn's psychological depravity, as medical examiners testified that the infant had been suffocated shortly after birth, his body hidden away like a shameful secret while Evelyn continued to cruise the high society clubs of the mountain. Facing the undeniable physical reality of the baby in the concrete tomb, and with Robinette working tirelessly to mitigate the damage, the jury found Evelyn guilty of the lesser charge of manslaughter, and the judge, determined to ensure she never walked free again to terrorize the community, sentenced the beautiful Black Widow to life imprisonment in the grim, fortress-like confines of the Kingston Penitentiary for Women. The heavy iron gates of the Kingston Penitentiary for Women slammed shut behind Evelyn Dick, sealing her away from the frantic glare of the media bulbs and the roaring outrage of a public that felt cheated by the complicated maneuvers of the legal system. For 11 long years, the woman who had once captivated the highest echelons of Hamilton society with her expensive silks and intoxicating perfumes lived a life reduced to a grey canvas of absolute uniformity, her days measured by the strict, quiet routines of prison labor, religious chapel services, and the cold reality of a tiny concrete cell. Within the thick limestone walls of the fortress-like prison, Evelyn proved to be an exemplary inmate, her volatile, manipulative nature seemingly dissolved into a state of quiet, submissive compliance that won the favor of the prison wardens and guards. She became a ghost in the national consciousness, a name that was occasionally whispered in dark taverns or written about in retrospective true crime articles, but a figure who had effectively been erased from the active fabric of Canadian life. When she was quietly granted parole in 1958 due to her immaculate behavioral record, the Government of Canada recognized that her safety and the peace of the community depended on her complete and total erasure from public view. Acting under a rare and highly classified administrative protocol, officials issued Evelyn a completely new identity, providing her with fresh legal documentation, a clean background history, and a destination far removed from the soot-stained streets of Hamilton. Before permanently sealing her original case files and personal records under a vault of national security that remains unbroken to this day. For decades, investigative journalists, amateur sleuths, and historians have tried to pierce this veil of bureaucratic silence, searching through faded census logs, death registries, and remote cemetery plots across the vast expanse of Canada. Yet every single lead has terminated in a complete and utter dead end. No one knows if Evelyn Dick married again, if she lived out her days as a quiet grandmother in a small, unsuspecting maritime town, or if she died alone in a crowded Toronto apartment building, her true identity hidden even from the doctors who cared for her in her final hours. This absolute, permanent anonymity is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire Hamilton torso murder, a chilling reminder that the law can sometimes protect the monster while leaving the memory of the innocent to fade into the background of history. As we look back across the decades at this dark, twisted tapestry of greed, deception, and industrial-scale butchery, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable truths that the case exposed about the world we inhabit. Evelyn Dick was not a monster born in a vacuum. She was the toxic product of a deeply hypocritical society that worshipped appearance over substance. A world where a mother could teach her daughter to weaponize her beauty and a father could embezzle thousands of dollars to fund a lifestyle of hollow luxury on the mountain while the working class labored in the heat of the steel furnaces below. The true tragedy of this story, the anchor that should hold our thoughts as the sensational details of the courtroom battles fade away, belongs entirely to John Dick, the quiet, gentle Scotsman who came to Canada with nothing but a dream of an honest life and a peaceful home. John was a man whose only sin was his naive, tragic sincerity, his absolute inability to comprehend the depth of the malice that was being directed toward him by the family he thought he had joined. He was reduced by his killers to an anonymous mass of flesh discarded in the cold mud of Albion Falls, his head and limbs turned to ash in his own home's furnace, his very identity almost stolen from him in a desperate bid to hide a financial crime. In telling his story, we must refuse to let him remain just a nameless torso in a textbook, and instead remember the streetcar driver who tipped his hat to the morning commuters, the man who believed in the sanctity of the law and the fundamental goodness of the human heart. His death stands as a solemn monument to the destructive power of absolute narcissism, a warning that beneath the most beautiful, polished facades of wealth and prestige can lie a darkness capable of tearing a human life apart without a single shred of mercy or regret. The ripples of the Hamilton torso murder did not settle with Evelyn Dick's final disappearance into anonymity. Instead, they permanently altered the landscape of Canadian criminal investigation, forensic science, and the psychological profiling of female offenders. In the decades that followed her release, criminologists and historians began to study the case not merely as a sensational crime of passion, but as a landmark study in psychopathy and familial criminal collusion. The bizarre cooperation between Evelyn, her father Donald McLean, and her various lovers exposed a deeply interconnected network of enabling behavior that challenged the mid-20th century legal understanding of domestic crime, proving that a polished, affluent facade could harbor an organized, multi-layered criminal syndicate. Forensically, the identification of John Dick's remains through minute skeletal anomalies and specialized dental analysis in the furnace ash laid the groundwork for modern forensic anthropology in Canada, demonstrating to police forces worldwide that no amount of fire or dismemberment could completely erase the biological truth of a victim's identity. The case became a standard curriculum piece in police academies, a grim reminder to young detectives that the most dangerous predators do not always lurk in dark alleys but can reside in well-appointed parlors, holding teacups with immaculate, manicured hands. Furthermore, the legal legacy of the trials, specifically the brilliant maneuvers of J.J. Robinette regarding the inadmissibility of coerced confessions, led to sweeping reforms in how Canadian law enforcement conducted suspect interrogations, establishing stricter guardrails to protect individual civil liberties and ensuring that future convictions would be built on unassailable physical evidence rather than pressured statements. Today, the quiet ravine near Albion Falls where the 5 young boys made their horrifying discovery looks much like it did in the crisp spring of 1946, the limestone cliffs of the Niagara Escarpment standing as silent, indifferent witnesses to the passage of time. The industrial smokestacks of Hamilton still paint the sky, but the memory of the streetcar driver who lost his life to a family's insatiable greed remains a haunting part of the city's folklore, a cautionary tale passed down through generations about the fatal cost of blind devotion. Ultimately, The Hamilton Torso murder forces us to look past the macabre details of the saw and the furnace and examine the fragile machinery of human justice, reminding us that while the law may sometimes be manipulated and the guilty may carry secrets to their graves under assumed names, the historical truth remains unyielding, demanding that we remember the victims and continue to seek light in the darkest corners of the human condition. As the final echoes of the Hamilton Torso murder fade into the deep recesses of history, the case leaves behind a profound cultural imprint that continues to resonate across modern true crime media, literature, and artistic expressions. The story of Evelyn Dick has transcended the boundaries of a simple historical event to become a dark Canadian myth, an enduring archetype of the femme fatale that challenges our deeply ingrained assumptions about gender, beauty, and criminality. Numerous books, theatrical plays, and television documentaries have attempted to dissect the enigma of the beautiful widow, each generation viewing her through a different lens, from the moral condemnation of the post-war era to the psychological curiosity of the 21st century. This cultural obsession stems from the unsettling realization that the human mind is capable of compartmentalizing extreme violence beneath a veneer of absolute elegance, a duality that continues to fascinate and disturb the public imagination. The image of the stylishly dressed Evelyn standing calmly in the prisoner's dock, completely unbothered by the graphic descriptions of her husband's dismemberment, remains one of the most iconic and chilling visual moments in Canadian legal history. Serving as a powerful inspiration for countless fictionalized crime stories and psychological thrillers. Beyond its artistic impact, the memory of the case serves as a vital historical anchor for the city of Hamilton itself, reflecting the dramatic socio-economic shifts and urban evolution that the region has undergone over the past 80 years. The old streetcar tracks where John Dick once guided his iron car have long since been paved over, replaced by modern asphalt and bustling transit systems, yet the physical geography of the city still tells the story of the stark class divisions that fueled the tragedy. The contrast between the lower industrial city and the affluent mountain estates remains etched into the landscape. A permanent reminder of how socio-economic pressures and the desperate desire for social mobility can warp human morality and create an environment where greed can fester into deadly violence. Community historians and preservationists continue to document the locations associated with the murder, ensuring that the human elements of the tragedy are not completely lost to the relentless march of urban redevelopment and that future generations understand the real-world contexts that gave rise to such unprecedented horror. In conclusion, the true value of revisiting the Hamilton Torso murder lies not in a macabre curiosity about the gruesome details of the saw or the concrete tomb, but in the enduring lessons it offers about the human condition and the absolute necessity of empathy, vigilance, and truth. The narrative of John Dick's brief, tragic marriage and horrific end serves as a timeless cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust and the devastating consequences of systemic manipulation, urging us to look beneath the surface of glamorous facades and demand genuine substance and integrity in our relationships and our institutions. By preserving the memory of the gentle Scotsman who served his community with dedication, we offer a small measure of the justice that was denied to him in life, ensuring that his name is remembered not for the manner of his death, but for the honesty and warmth with which he lived. His legacy stands as a quiet but unyielding light against the dark shadows cast by Evelyn Dick and her family, a reminder that even when the guilty vanish into the fog of history under assumed identities, the collective memory of the community will always hold a space for the innocent. Demanding that their stories be told with dignity, respect, and a commitment to historical truth. The enduring fascination with the Hamilton Torso murder also forces a deeper examination of the media's role in shaping public perception and the narrative of crime in the mid-20th century. In 1946, the explosion of yellow journalism and sensationalist tabloid reporting found its perfect subject in Evelyn Dick, transforming the courthouse into a media circus and the city of Hamilton into a stage for national voyeurism. The relentless coverage did more than just report the facts. It constructed a highly theatrical version of reality where the line between true crime and pulp fiction became dangerously blurred. This historical media frenzy marks the early genesis of our modern true crime consumption, demonstrating how easily a human tragedy can be commercialized and consumed as entertainment. The intense scrutiny from journalists from across North America created an environment where the public felt entitled to every intimate detail of the McLean household, ultimately complicating the legal proceedings and influencing the volatile atmosphere surrounding the jurors. Looking back at those yellowed newspaper clippings, modern analysts see a mirror of our current societal obsession with true crime, highlighting the ethical responsibility that creators and consumers share when handling the real lives and deaths of individuals whose tragedies are preserved for public consumption. This case also stands as a significant point of reflection for the evolution of institutional corrections and the concept of rehabilitation within the Canadian penal system. Evelyn Dick's 11-year incarceration at the Kingston Penitentiary for Women and her subsequent successful parole in 1958 were heavily debated by legal scholars who questioned whether an individual associated with such horrific crimes could truly be rehabilitated. The decision by the parole board to grant her freedom and a completely clean slate was a massive gamble on the human capacity for change, or perhaps a pragmatic recognition that her continued presence in the prison system posed a permanent security risk due to the public's relentless hostility. The absolute secrecy surrounding her new life under an assumed identity reflects a profound institutional belief in the possibility of redemption and protection after debt repayment, a philosophical stance that contrasts sharply with the punitive desires of the public. This aspect of the aftermath continues to spark intense debates in legal circles regarding the balance between public transparency, victim justice, and the constitutional rights of a paroled individual to seek a peaceful existence away from the ghosts of their past crimes. Ultimately, as the physical structures associated with the case, the house on Carrick Avenue and the old streetcar barns, continue to weather the passage of time, the Hamilton torso murder remains a ghostly whisper in the wind that sweeps over the Niagara Escarpment. It is a story that refuses to be neatly filed away because it touches upon the fundamental anxieties of society, the fear of the enemy within the home, the corruption of institutional power, and the terrifying realization that absolute evil can wear a face of pure, captivating beauty. The memory of John Dick, preserved through the dedication of those who refused to let his tragedy be reduced to a mere footnote, serves as the moral center of this sprawling, dark narrative. His life reminds us that behind every sensational headline, every true crime podcast episode, and every historical script, there is a real human heart that once beat, a family that grieved, and an innocent life cut short by the unchecked darkness of others. By holding on to his memory with dignity and focusing on the lessons of justice, integrity, and truth, we ensure that the final word in the tragic tale of Hamilton's most notorious crime does not belong to the monsters who committed it, but to the enduring demand for human decency and historical remembrance. The psychological profile of Evelyn Dick remains one of the most studied and parsed case studies in the history of Canadian criminology, offering a terrifying glimpse into the mechanics of extreme sociopathy and narcissistic personality disorder. Criminologists who have deconstructed her behavior point out that her actions were not the result of a sudden mental break or a momentary lapse of reason, but rather the logical, chilling extension of a lifetime of conditioning. Raised in an environment where people were viewed strictly as commodities to be bartered, Evelyn developed an absolute deficit of empathy, viewing the world through a purely transactional lens where the suffering of others was completely irrelevant to her own immediate desires. Her ability to compartmentalize her life was so profound that she could orchestrate the gruesome dissection of her husband and the cement burial of her infant son while simultaneously maintaining her status as a charming, sought-after socialite in the city's most exclusive circles. This total fragmentation of personality allowed her to step into the courtroom day after day without a single trace of guilt or anxiety, treating the capital murder trial not as a desperate fight for her life, but as a theatrical performance where she was the undisputed star. Her cold detachment was her ultimate armor, a psychological shield that completely disarmed the primitive interrogation techniques of the era and allowed her to manipulate seasoned detectives with the same effortless ease she used to exploit her wealthy suitors. The case also sheds a critical light on the phenomenon of familial criminal dynamics and how toxic domestic environments can foster intergenerational criminality. Donald McLean and his wife did not merely fail as parents, they actively engineered a criminal enterprise, using their daughter as the spearhead to infiltrate and exploit the wealthy upper class of Hamilton. The father's financial crimes within the streetcar company were intimately linked to Evelyn's insatiable demands for luxury, creating a destructive feedback loop of theft and extravagance that ultimately required a human sacrifice to protect. When John Dick discovered the embezzlement and threatened to expose the family, he was not just threatening Donald McLean's freedom, he was threatening the entire collective illusion that the family had spent decades constructing. The decision to eliminate John was a cooperative family executive action, a desperate and ruthless defensive maneuver born from a shared panic that exposed how completely the boundaries of basic human morality had been erased within the walls of 32 Carrick Avenue. This level of coordinated family violence, where parents and children collaborate to execute, dismember, and incinerate a relative, remains an exceptionally rare occurrence in the annals of global true crime. Making the Hamilton torso murder a vital point of reference for specialized behavior analysts studying the dark phenomenon of shared psychotic loops and criminal collusion within immediate family units. In the grander scheme of historical remembrance, the ongoing dialogue surrounding the Hamilton torso murder forces a critical reflection on how modern society constructs its heroes and villains within the true crime genre. For decades, the media's lens has been heavily distorted by a morbid fascination with Evelyn Dick, her beauty, her high-fashion wardrobe, and her mysterious post-prison disappearance frequently overshadowing the profound human cost of her actions. This narrative imbalance is a common trap in true crime documentation, where the charisma of the perpetrator inadvertently eclipses the quiet dignity of the victim, reducing a brutal tragedy into a stylized piece of noir fiction. To truly honor the memory of John Dick and the nameless infant Peter David White, creators and historians must consciously shift the perspective away from the predatory allure of the Black Widow and focus instead on the devastating weight of their loss. John Dick's life was cut short because he possessed a simple, old-fashioned honesty that could not coexist with the deep corruption of the McLean household, and his brutal death must be remembered as a sacrifice to integrity rather than just a macabre plot point. By ensuring that our analysis remains grounded in profound empathy for the victims and a rigorous commitment to institutional truth, we transform a tale of historical horror into a meaningful exploration of human resilience. Reminding ourselves that the ultimate purpose of justice is not to glamorize the monster, but to provide a permanent, dignified voice to those who were so brutally silenced in the shadows of the past. The socio-legal implications of the Hamilton torso murder also extend deeply into the history of how the Canadian state handles highly sensitive criminal identities and the concept of witness or paroled convict protection. The decision to grant Evelyn Dick a completely new identity in 1958 was not an act of official leniency, but a calculated, protective measure designed to prevent a potential public execution by an enraged citizenry. In the late 1950s, the public sentiment surrounding her acquittal for the murder of her husband was still incredibly raw, and the revelation of her infant son's mummified remains had permanently stamped her as a symbol of ultimate maternal depravity. Had she been released back into society under her birth name, her chances of survival were astronomically low, as vigilantism and public harassment would have trailed her every step, creating a permanent state of civil unrest and a logistical nightmare for local law enforcement. By choosing to completely erase Evelyn Dick from the national grid, the Canadian government effectively pioneered a primitive version of the modern witness protection program. Establishing a precedent where the preservation of public order and the constitutional safety of a paroled individual took precedence over the public's right to information or a victim's family's desire for ongoing visibility. This absolute state-sponsored erasure created a clean procedural break that allowed the justice system to close the book on a case that had threatened to compromise the integrity of its highest political and judicial institutions. This comprehensive administrative disappearance also highlights the deep, structural relationship between institutional secrecy and the preservation of upper-class societal structures during the post-war era. It has long been suspected by historical researchers and political analysts that Evelyn Dick's complete erasure was heavily accelerated by the very men who had once frequented her private parlor, prominent figures in business, law, and politics whose careers would have been completely demolished had she ever chosen to publish a detailed memoir or speak openly to the press about her past exploits. Her silence was a highly valuable commodity, and the provision of a secure, anonymous life in a distant province can be viewed as the final, ultimate transaction in a long history of corrupt bargains. By ensuring that Evelyn Dick could never again be found or questioned, The elite of Hamilton and Ontario effectively buried the ledger of their own moral indiscretions alongside the tragic remains of John Dick, ensuring that the post-war narrative of a clean, progressive, and highly respectable Canadian society remained completely untarnished. The wall of official silence that still surrounds her hidden life serves as a stark reminder of how easily the machinery of state power can be deployed to protect the collective interests of the ruling class, turning a gruesome capital murder investigation into a permanent, highly managed state secret. Ultimately, as we look back through the long, dark corridor of time at the legacy of the Hamilton torso murder, we are left with a profound sense of the fragility of human memory and the ethical weight of true crime storytelling. The passage of 80 years has transformed the agonizing, visceral horror of the basement on Carrick Avenue into a detached historical curiosity, a collection of yellowed newsprint and academic case studies that are analyzed with clinical objectivity. Yet, the moral responsibility of the historian and the scriptwriter is to resist this natural desensitization, to constantly pull the narrative back to the raw human suffering that lies at its core. John Dick was not a fictional character in a Gothic noir novel. He was a living, breathing man who knew the bite of the winter wind, the warmth of a cup of tea after a long shift, and the paralyzing terror of realizing that the people he trusted had planned his absolute destruction. Peter David White was a child who deserved a life of promise, not a cold cement grave inside a forgotten suitcase. By refusing to glamorize the calculated coldness of Evelyn Dick and instead anchoring our narrative in a deep, unyielding respect for those who were lost, we perform an act of historical justice, ensuring that the final, lasting impression of Hamilton's most notorious crime is not the beauty of the monster, but the enduring dignity of the innocent souls she attempted to erase. The deep-seated historical trauma inflicted by the Hamilton torso murder on the community of Southern Ontario also invites a profound exploration into the geography of crime and how specific physical structures become repositories of collective memory. 4 decades after the trials concluded, the house at 32, Carrick Avenue stood not just as a piece of residential real estate, but as a grim monument to a dark collective past, an urban scar that neighbors and passers-by looked at with a mixture of morbid curiosity and visible shuddering. Even as new families moved into the area and the neighborhood underwent the natural, slow transformations of the post-war housing boom, the knowledge of what had occurred within that basement and attic hung over the property like a persistent, toxic fog. True crime enthusiasts, amateur historians, and local youths would often walk past the quiet home, staring at the basement windows where the iron furnace once roared, trying to comprehend how such monumental evil could be contained within a standard brick duplex. The physical survival of these crime scenes creates a strange, liminal space where the past and the present constantly collide, forcing a modern city to live side by side with the physical ghosts of its darkest hour and ensuring that the gruesome events of 1946 could never be completely dismissed as mere mythology or distant historical fiction. This spatial haunting extends to the rugged expanses of Albion Falls and the Niagara Escarpment, locations that are today celebrated for their natural beauty and ecological significance, yet remain permanently stained in the annals of local history by the discovery of John Dick's severed remains. The contrast between the serene, picturesque waterfall and the visceral horror of a discarded, butchered human trunk creates a powerful psychological dissonance that challenges our perception of nature as a place of pure, untamed innocence. For the families of the 5 young boys who stumbled upon that burlap bundle, the woods were forever ruined, transformed from a childhood kingdom of adventure into a site of lifelong psychological scarring and unyielding nightmares. The narrative of their discovery highlights the fragile nature of innocence in a world where the domestic horrors of adults can so easily bleed into the pristine spaces of youth, leaving a legacy of generational trauma that quietly shaped the social fabric of the surrounding communities for decades after the police lines were taken down and the reporters left the valley. Ultimately, as we analyze the sprawling historical legacy of the Hamilton torso murder, we are forced to recognize that the case represents a crucial crossroads in the evolution of societal attitudes toward domestic violence, female criminality, and the psychological burdens of justice. Evelyn Dick's life and crimes shattered the comfortable, patriarchal illusions of the era, forcing a conservative Canadian public to accept that a woman could possess a level of calculated, cold-blooded cruelty that equaled or surpassed any male predator in the nation's history. By stripping away the protective biases that shielded beautiful, upper-class women from deep legal scrutiny, the case accelerated a more realistic, objective understanding of criminal psychology that refuses to equate aesthetic elegance with moral innocence. As the passage of time continues to soften the immediate, visceral edges of the tragedy, our ethical duty remains to keep the memory of John Dick and his infant son firmly anchored in truth. Transforming a narrative of profound human depravity into a lasting testament to the necessity of systemic justice, compassion for the forgotten, and the relentless pursuit of historical integrity. The structural transformation of the city of Hamilton throughout the late 20th century further mirrors the slow, quiet burial of the Hamilton torso murder within the archives of local history, as the physical remnants of that dark era were systematically dismantled by modern urban development. The heavy industrial identity that once defined the lower city began to shift as the old factories modernized or closed, and with them went the generation of streetcar lines and neighborhood hubs that had formed the backdrop of John Dick's daily life. This physical erasure of the landscape created a parallel psychological erasure, as the city actively sought to redefine its identity away from the grim, smoke-stained reputation of its mid-century past. Yet, for historical researchers who dig beneath the modern infrastructure, the layers of the city still whisper of the deep class divisions and toxic domestic dynamics that allowed the McLean family enterprise to function for so long unchallenged. The case serves as a poignant example of structural history, illustrating how the rapid, chaotic growth of a post-war manufacturing city can inadvertently create dark zones of legal and moral unaccountability, where personal ambition can twist into lethal sociopathy under the heavy pressure of sudden socio-economic shifts. This long-term historical perspective also invites a critical re-evaluation of how early psychiatric evaluations failed to accurately diagnose or categorize individuals like Evelyn Dick, highlighting the primitive state of criminal psychology in the immediate post-war era. During her trials, the psychological assessments provided by state doctors were heavily constrained by traditional, moralistic views of female behavior, often classifying her actions as a result of moral degeneracy or emotional instability rather than recognizing the profound, cold-board structure of psychopathic narcissism that modern clinicians would immediately identify. This lack of advanced diagnostic tools allowed Evelyn to navigate her incarceration and eventual parole with a high degree of success. As the institutional frameworks of the time were easily manipulated by an individual who possessed an innate understanding of superficial charm and behavioral compliance. The study of her prison records, though heavily restricted, reveals a woman who adapted to the rigid rules of the Kingston Penitentiary not out of a genuine desire for internal reform, but as a strategic deployment of compliance to secure her ultimate freedom. Demonstrating the complex challenges that high-level sociopaths present to traditional correctional systems that rely on visible signs of remorse as a metric for true rehabilitation. In the end, as we close this exhaustive investigation into the darkest chapter of Ontario's judicial past, the legacy of the Hamilton torso murder must be framed not by the enduring mystery of Evelyn Dick's hidden post-prison life, but by our collective refusal to let the voices of her victims be permanently silenced by the passage of time. John Dick's quiet life, his simple pride in his work, and his tragic death at the hands of those he trusted should serve as the true historical anchor for every narrative that seeks to explore these events, transforming a story of sensationalized horror into a profound meditation on the value of individual human dignity. The nameless infant Peter David White, whose brief existence was cast into a cold concrete block, must also be held in our thoughts as a symbol of the ultimate cost of unchecked personal ambition and systemic domestic neglect. By approaching this grim historical record with a commitment to deep empathy, rigorous factual integrity, and a refusal to glamorize the predator, we fulfill our highest duty as true crime chroniclers, ensuring that the final, lasting testament of Hamilton's most notorious crime is a profound demand for justice, historical memory, and an unyielding respect for the innocent souls who were lost in the shadows of the past. The profound historical resonance of the Hamilton torso murder also forces a deeper exploration into the concept of restorative justice and whether the true narrative scale of such a crime can ever be fully balanced by the institutional processes of the state. When Evelyn Dick walked out of the prison gates into a life of government-funded anonymity, it created a permanent, open wound in the collective memory of Hamilton's working class. A community that felt the weight of John Dick's absence every time his old streetcar route rattled through the lower city. This systemic failure to provide an open, transparent conclusion to the tragedy highlights the inevitable friction between the cold, procedural pragmatism of the legal system and the human need for public accountability and emotional closure. The state chosen to prioritize the quiet containment of a volatile social scandal over the raw, public demand for ongoing retribution, creating a historical precedent where the complete erasure of a perpetrator was deemed more valuable to societal stability than the continuous, visible memorialization of the victims. This structural decision has forced future generations of historians and community chroniclers to take on the mantle of memory, actively working to ensure that the passage of decades does not dissolve the sharp, painful realities of John Dick's sacrifice into a sanitized, abstract ghost story. This active preservation of history is particularly vital in an era where the digital landscape can easily distort historical facts, transforming real human suffering into fleeting, sensationalized content for rapid public consumption. The responsibility of writing about the basement on Carrick Avenue or the cold slopes of Albion Falls carries a heavy ethical burden, requiring an unyielding resistance to the temptation of reductionist storytelling that turns complex psychological and systemic tragedies into mere dramatic plot points. Every detail of John Dick's life, from his careful maintenance of his transit uniform to his deep Scottish pride, must be handled with the same meticulous care that forensic scientists use to identify his remains, ensuring that his humanity is never eclipsed by the grotesque mechanics of his murder. Similarly, the tragic, brief existence of infant Peter David White must be kept at the forefront of our moral consciousness, standing as a permanent, heartbreaking indictment of an environment where the most vulnerable could be cast into stone and forgotten while the adults around them chased the hollow illusions of high society prestige. Ultimately, as the year 2026 marks another milestone in the long, dark timeline since those young boys first stumbled upon that burlap bundle in the woods, the legacy of the Hamilton Torso murder remains an unyielding testament to the necessity of structural truth, deep societal empathy, and the permanent defense of human dignity. The modern city of Hamilton has grown, evolved, and shed much of the industrial soot that once defined its mid-century streets, but its foundational history remains deeply intertwined with the lessons learned from its darkest hour. By approaching this narrative with a rigorous commitment to factual integrity, an absolute refusal to glamorize the calculated coldness of the McLean family, and a profound respect for the innocent souls who were lost, we perform a vital act of historical preservation, ensuring that the final, lasting impression of this notorious crime is not the mystery of the monster who escaped into the fog, but the enduring, dignified voice of the community that refused to let its victims be forgotten. The complex web of relationships and systemic corruption revealed by the Hamilton Torso murder also invites us to examine the profound sociological shift in how early post-war communities viewed domestic safety and the hidden realities of suburban neighborhoods. In 1946, as soldiers returned from the battlefields of Europe, society desperately craved a return to normalcy, stability, and the idealized dream of peaceful family life. The horrors that unfolded inside 32 Carrick Avenue shattered this fragile illusion, proving that the most terrifying violence did not always belong to distant battlefields or the criminal underworld of foreign metropolises, but could exist right next door, hidden behind neatly painted shutters and well-kept gardens. This realization triggered a quiet crisis of trust within the working-class neighborhoods of Hamilton, as residents began to look at their neighbors with a new, lingering suspicion, wondering what dark secrets might be hidden beneath the routine pleasantries of daily life. The case forced a collective awakening regarding the dark undercurrents of the domestic sphere, destroying the comfortable assumption that the home was an inherently safe space and exposing how easily the pressures of social climbing and unchecked materialism could toxicify the core of a family unit until it collapsed into absolute barbarism. This domestic betrayal is precisely what makes the tragedy of John Dick so universally resonant, standing as a timeless warning about the vulnerability of an honest soul when trapped within an ecosystem of pure deceit. John was a man who lived by a straightforward, unwritten contract with the world: if you work hard, speak the truth, and treat others with respect, you will receive the same in return. When he entered the McLean household, He had no conceptual framework for understanding people who viewed human beings as disposable stepping stones, or who could look at a son-in-law and see nothing but an obstacle to be brutally eliminated and fed into a furnace. His inability to see the trap until it was too late was not a flaw in his character, but a testament to his purity, a reflection of a man who refused to believe that the world could be as cold and calculating as Evelyn Dick and her father made it out to be. By centering our analysis on his innocence and his shock, we strip away the historical detachment that decades of retelling can create, restoring the visceral, heartbreaking weight of a life stolen by a family of predators who valued a stolen fortune and a hollow social reputation over the very sanctity of human existence. Ultimately, as the narrative of the Hamilton Torso murder reaches its final analytical chapters, our understanding of the case must remain anchored in a commitment to deep historical justice and an unwavering refusal to let the sensationalism of the past dictate the truth of the present. The state may have chosen to bury Evelyn Dick's final years beneath a mountain of official secrets and sealed dossiers, but it could never erase the moral ledger of her crimes or the enduring memory of those she harmed. The true record of the tragedy is not kept in the classified vaults of the Canadian government, but in the collective heart of the community that continues to tell John Dick's story with dignity and respect. By treating his memory not as a macabre historical artifact, but as a living reminder of the value of individual human worth, we ensure that his quiet, hard-working spirit is given the lasting peace that was so violently stolen from him in the dark basement of Carrick Avenue. Leaving a legacy that demands we always look past the beautiful facades of the world to protect and honor the innocent souls who walk among us.